December 12th, 2017, Shelburne Select Board meeting. It's my understanding Colleen will be with us shortly. First up, let's consider approval of the agenda. Joe, do you have any proposed changes?
I think if Jerry's agreeable, I haven't had a chance to do anything on agenda item number 12. If it's possible to maybe do that tomorrow.
Okay, Jerry, that was your suggestion. Are you good with that?
Yeah, I'm okay. When we get to it, I'll just review it quickly so everybody's together. It's a 4 or 5 line thing, and
Okay.
what Joe and I were discussing is actually producing it and getting everybody to sign. Tomorrow's fine, because I go Friday for the meeting. His last meeting is Friday.
Okay, so
So
do
we
you
can
want to
hand
keep it on
carry
the
it.
agenda then?
Yeah,
tonight?
if you would, and then I'll
Yes.
just quickly review
Okay.
it for
Okay.
anybody in
Great.
the audience who
Sure.
might have an interest.
Sure. You have anything else, Joe?
I don't.
Does anyone on the board have anything? Someone like to move to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Moved by Josh. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Jamie. Any discussion? Anyone? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, next is consider approving some meeting minutes. Let's do them one at a time. November 14th. Does anyone have any suggestions for changes?
November 14th. Yeah, and it's just typing. I mean, it's just name. Because I know names are really difficult to hear off of the tape, I suspect. Page 11. Unless she wants to change her name. I think that Janet should be Shannon.
Excuse me, should be what?
Shannon.
Shannon. Oh, okay, Shannon, okay.
And
Second.
it appears again in the fourth paragraph.
Okay, yep. Any other things, Josh?
No, I think that was
Anyone
it.
else have any changes they'd like to propose for November 14th? No? Someone like to move to approve the minutes of November 14th?
So moved?
Moved by Jerry. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Jamie. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Can I just check to see if that's one that I was,
You left at 10:30 that day.
okay,
So the easiest thing is just to abstain.
abstain.
All right, next is November 24th. Does anyone have any suggested changes?
28.
The 28th, I'm sorry if I said the wrong.
I got 2 typos as well on page 2.
Yes?
Under 7, it's Wendy without
Oh, yeah.
the Y, Saville.
Good.
All right.
And on page
Wow, that's pretty impressive, Jerry.
5, it's singular town needs, rather than plural under comments, 3rd line down. 11
Right.
comments, 3rd
Great.
line down.
Anyone else have anything? Does everyone agree with those two, by the way? Good. So, did we already have a motion to approve?
No,
Okay.
also move.
Moved by Jerry to approve minutes of November 28th. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Jamie. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Abstain.
Okay, next item will be the minutes of December 2nd. Quick minutes,
Easiest ever.
short ones. So anyone have any proposed changes? No? Okay, someone like to move to approve?
So moved.
Moved by Jamie, second.
Second.
Second by Jerry. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Abstain.
All right, so on item 4. This is 10 minutes now for public comments for items not on the agenda. These are for items over which this board has jurisdiction, not on tonight's agenda. We have 10 minutes now, and then if there are more, they'll come later in the meeting. Chris Boyd has his hand up, so I assume he wants to speak first.
Good evening, folks.
Good evening.
Chris Boyd, Thomas Road. So, I'm gonna ask the question that's probably got a lot of people's curiosity burning. With Judge Sessions' ruling, will the town be appealing?
There is an executive session scheduled tomorrow to discuss the ruling and what, if anything, the board will do.
So
It's a board decision.
it is a board decision, yeah. I was hoping maybe you would have an idea tonight and you were gonna discuss strategy or whatever, if that's where you were going with it.
No, nor would I discuss legal strategy in a public meeting.
I understand that. My question isn't legal strategy, it's just, are you or aren't you? So with that, understand you're gonna have the meeting tomorrow night. I would
Late
really,
afternoon.
I would, okay. I would really like to put my 2 cents in that it's gone far enough. The expenses that have been incurred now are going to have to be picked up and something probably dropped out of the budget to cover that. The expenses to bring it to the next level are gonna be mind-numbing. Because it's all out of town, it's travel, it's lodging, there's gonna be a lot more expenses incurred to take it to the next level. And the next level isn't gonna produce anything different. So, I would prefer to see the time more working to make sure there isn't a problem than to try and follow the path that's been followed so far, because it hasn't led anywhere. So it's time for a new path.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Sarr had his hand up before anyone else. So Mr. Sarr is choosing the order now. Dr. Metz?
I have two concerns, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
And we won't come anywhere near the 10 minutes on my account, I hope. First, just so that we have closure, I would like to ask if it has been a formal determination by the board that no further action will be taken relative to Chief Jim Warden's separation from this community. I just want to, I understand the letter that you received. I trust that's not necessarily gospel. That's advice, which you can, you may choose to accept or not accept in total or in part. And for clarification, I'm just trying to find out whether, as far as you all are concerned, that's the last word has been spoken on that matter. My second concern, in conjunction with Chris Boyd's comments, is that although you're meeting in executive session tomorrow, I understand from the open meeting law that no decisions, no formal decisions can be made at that time. Is that correct? Do I have that correct? Those are my two questions.
Okay, first, let's, anyone would like to respond to his first question?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. There are actually several pieces of unfinished business. And certainly in my personal view, we're quite a ways from resolving those or any others. One is the town manager's legal representative has addressed a letter to us, as you know, that was read aloud at the previous meeting. And I think issues run all the way to the hope for pie in the sky, maybe possibility that I keep in my mind that by some period of time, the former chief, will be welcome in town and commended in a way that has not yet happened. So in my personal view, there's still quite a bit of business. The only plea I think one or more of us might make is that we do have an awful lot of other stuff in front of us tonight.
Well, I don't ask for a decision. I ask for an indication of your state of mind relative to this.
From my personal
business.
point of view, you're so assured.
Right, and I don't have any, I mean, I haven't heard any, there's certainly been no formal decision by anybody in the board, or by the board in a whole to make anything. So I agree with Jerry, there's still some things that I'd like to see addressed as well.
Okay.
Okay, someone want to address the second question? If anybody would like to?
Well, you can. I mean, I can. I believe that Dr. Metz is correct that open meetings does say that no actions can be taken in executive session. If there was an action to be taken, it would have to be in a public forum.
Tomorrow's afternoon is a public forum, I understand, and it's just going to be an executive session relative to that and maybe some other matters. So it is possible then that some action could be taken tomorrow. Is that correct?
Quite correct.
It's possible, yeah.
Okay, but I'd like to weigh in also.
Yes, sir.
We've been advised by that when it comes to matters regarding legal strategy, those are not always discussed in open session.
Yes, it's not the strategy, sir, it's just the decision as to whether or not further legal action from the town will be taken. I don't ask for strategy, I just ask for the
Well,
knowledge of the decision.
we'll be conducting ourselves pursuant to legal advice that we receive.
But there
Right.
will be discussion of that tomorrow afternoon,
Yes, sir.
because if there has ever been an occasion where involvement of the public beyond a year and a half and $500,000 and a divisiveness that's hurting everybody equally, this is it.
Yes.
And there will be a discussion, some of us hope, how extensive or short-lived we'll see, to the point that the actual decision, what specific action is being taken, short of strategy, will be introduced and hopefully discussed.
And that is at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, is that correct?
I think it's at 4:30. There's a chance if the town attorney can get here sooner, it might start a little sooner. It's also ending at the end of our long day budget, and
Yes, sir.
after starting at 9 o'clock, who's to say whether we'll finish at 4 or 4:20 or,
Yes, sir.
so.
And it'll be here?
Yes.
Yes. All right, we have a couple more minutes. Mr. Sarr?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, I regard this as a delaying tactic, which is really unacceptable. Judge Sessions rendered his judgment, and a damning one it was for your position, some days ago. You've had ample time to discuss this among yourselves. Please reassure the town that you're not going to go deeper into this folly by appealing this decision. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Rydell?
Linda Reel, Falls Road.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I have a comment to make. I understand it's not under the jurisdiction of the select board, but it's a little food for thought. It's been on the public mind. And that is that we are starting to talk about the hiring of a new police chief. And I just have a few thoughts on that matter. I feel it should be done by a committee in the same manner as the town manager hire. The committee should consist of a variety of members, and those would be community members, someone from fire or rescue, one of our state reps, a dispatcher, an officer from the department, an officer in leadership position from an outside agency, and a select board member. And I would support Jerry as a likely candidate for that, taking into consideration his experience in working with municipal employees and hiring thereof. Thank you.
Okay, we have another 2 minutes. Who would like to finish up?
Sean Moran, Shelburne. So as a complete disclosure, I did come in on the roads today and they were covered with salt, which I was very thankful for. So I felt safer doing that than I probably would having a meal at Wake Robin, and maybe we should consider putting Bryson on the hazardous waste list, just in case. So that was a little humor just to tease the board. I have no head legally, so I called my son when I got this thing Thursday night. I sent it to him, we Skyped. Works for one of the top law firms in the United States. And he had 3 observations. He said, Dad, are you blinking serious? It's the railroad. And he said, your little hamlet of Shelburne got a severe public spanking, and please learn from that. And his last was, what the hell did this little puppy cost? Now, hopefully Judge Sessions put this little vendetta to bed, but I asked in the spirit of Christmas, and we'd all pray that we have collective heads on the board and not selective heads when you're voting. Because I know there's a couple that would love to see this go on, and then there's some reasonable ones, hopefully, that would love to see it put to bed. Because this board has a lot on your plate, other than the railroad. And the town, many in the town are sick of it. As I'm sure you'll say, many are not sick of it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next is our number 5 budget presentation from the town manager.
You want to live?
No, we're going to do the rest later.
Very rarely do I get time to talk, so I'm going to
You're gonna do the.
enjoy it. Peter, after you're ready. Okay. Thank you very much. I put down 45 minutes for myself because I was excited to have a few minutes to address the select board and the public. I don't think it'll take that long, don't worry. But I'm taking a little bit of a different tack this year than past budget years, especially because I realize that there's been a lot of new faces here, both just the town government in general, and so I thought it might be more helpful, instead of digging into the weeds, to take a little bit of a step back and kind of look at things from a 30,000-foot view. I also want to be clear that, so the select board received budget binders over the weekend. There is a line item budget in there, which I hopefully was very clear. This is not the town manager's budget, and what you are receiving right now is not the town manager's recommended budget. This is a long process, it's an iterative process. We're at a kind of a launching off point. By the town charter, I need to provide the select board with a budget 45 days before the annual town meeting, but we will go through this presentation tonight. There's going to be an all-day budget hearing tomorrow. Next week, we'll talk more about the budget. I'll try to look at the tea leaves and read the tea leaves and repackage the budget before the new year. That will be the town manager's official budget to the select board by January 1st, and then they'll work on it from there. So, when we're talking about, I just want to be clear, the fiscal year 2019 budget, it can be confusing, especially for Peter and I at this point, because we're currently in the FY 2018 budget, we're auditing the FY 2017 budget, and we're preparing the FY 2019 budget. So the budget that I'm talking about here is July 1st, 2018 to June 30th, 2019. That's the FY 2019 budget, the one that eventually voters will vote on in March. I want to be clear that the wastewater and water budgets are adopted separately. The wastewater budget is adopted by the select board in May or June. The water budget is adopted by the water commissioners in May or June. And those are paid for by the utility fees of either the wastewater users or the water users. The general fund budget that we're talking about is what impacts the property tax. All right. Oh, good job. All right, and I apologize. Our normal projector has a light out, so I'm not trying to hammer home the point that we need some technology improvements, but I will not. Wah, wah. But I will not, I'm not going to spend too much time looking at the slides. I just really want to talk to the folks here. But this is an iterative process, the budget process. It's supposed to be engaging, ask questions, both the board and the public. This is supposed to be a give and take. And like I said, there's a few weeks that I'll be kind of working on the budget to give the select board, and there's another month after that for the select board to work on the budget. We're kind of in the middle of a long process to get to the end, hopefully in March, to have a budget adopted, and then it will be effective in July. Okay, ready? So taking a step back a little bit, I think this is the, try to find the maybe historic image of New England local government. And I want to talk a little bit about how this is a misleading and false image, not just because it's not just middle-aged white men making decisions, but you know, local government. I teach a class at the university, and kids that take the class, and for the most part, they take it because they don't have anything else to do on Wednesday, or they need 3 credits, and they end up finding it very interesting. In civics classes across the country, in high school and college, graduate school, you learn a lot about the federal government, maybe a little bit about the state government, and very little about local government. And I would argue that local government is hands down the most exciting. It's the most dynamic. There's a lot of variation into local governments. And local governments throughout the country, not just in Vermont, are organized in almost an infinite number of ways. There's city managers in big cities like Dallas. There's mayors, there's strong mayors, there's weak mayors. There's different ways that, just think of how Shelburne elects its legislative body relative to Burlington, for example. In Burlington, you are elected by wards, so part of, in different geography, have certain people that go and represent them. In Shelburne, the way that we're organized is that, I mean, it's possible that 5 neighbors could be on the select board. It's a different setup. Also, for example, in Burlington, there's a mayor who acts more like a strong mayor, does some functions like a city manager, but not totally. In Montpelier, there's also a mayor, but it's a weak mayor form of government that still has a city manager who operates a little bit more like me. And all around the country, there's infinite number of ways. In Brattleboro, for example, it's unique to Vermont, but something that you'll find more with more frequency in Massachusetts, for example, and maybe in Maine too, that Jerry would know. Brattleboro has a form of government called representative town government. Rather than open town meeting where everyone can come and vote on the budget, they actually elect 100 or 125 delegates who make town meeting decisions on behalf of the entire community. Again, that's unique to Brattleboro and Vermont, but that's something that you find around the country with a little bit more frequency than you find in Vermont. The point being is that there are local governments function in a very dynamic way, different ways across the country. The way that Shelburne votes on a budget and approves a budget is much different than Heinsberg. For example, when I was town administrator in Heinsberg, the annual budget is voted on the floor at town meeting. It's not an Australian ballot vote the next day. It's not only is it voted on the floor, but they've broken it up by departments. So literally, there'll be a motion on the floor to defund a certain department, or eliminate in half the police budget. That's for example. Those things can happen at town meeting in Heinsberg, just next door. In Middlebury, I also worked in Middlebury. They vote the budget on the floor, but rather than breaking it up by departments, it's an all-for-nothing vote. You vote on the entire budget as one article. Again, that's different. Here in Shelburne, it's voted on by Australian ballot the next day, not on the floor at town meeting. And I promise you, every place I go, they wish that they did it a different way. So there's pluses and minuses, obviously, to the way that budgets are adopted across Vermont. There's no right or wrong way. I also want to talk about why, before we get into the budget, kind of why we exist as a local government in Shelburne. This is a municipal corporation. I think sometimes that gets lost to make a false analogy between local government in Shelburne to Montpelier or to Washington, D.C. The select board members here are really the board of directors of a municipal corporation. It's a little bit different than I think what you think about the federal government, where your congressmen or senators are, there's checks and balances with the executive branch and the judicial. It's a different setup here, and the select board is the board of directors of a municipal corporation. It says that right in the charter. It's a municipal corporation. And we exist to provide elections and provide services like police and fire, to plow roads and to have recreation and open spaces. These are the type of services, quality of life services, that Shelburne local government exists to deliver. All right. Okay, so oftentimes I've found that when we focus on municipal budgets, it's usually on the expenditure side. But it's important, I think, to start on the revenue side. And I realize that this pie chart doesn't equal 100%. The point, hold on one second. The point that I want to make is that you know, if you looked at our revenues, or if we thought about this as an investment portfolio, we're not very well diversified. And this is not uncommon to Vermont. The primary source of revenue is property taxes. About 75 to 80% of all revenue that comes to support municipal functions comes from the property tax. Very small amounts come from any other source. 4%, 3%, 2% and less from any other source. I mean, the next significant sources of income just pale in comparison to the property tax. Other municipalities in Vermont have things like local option taxes that offset. We do not have that in Shelburne. And again, across the country, there's other sources of revenue that come in to support municipal functions. In Vermont, we're similar to most, where it's almost primarily on the property tax. But, I can't, I'm sorry. I know. Well, that's why I'm going to just try to speak as much as I can. I'm trying not to use the slides too much. So on the property tax, when you pay your property taxes, 80% roughly of your tax payment goes to the state education fund, and 20% goes in support of municipal functions, police, fire, highway. If you look at, this is per $100,000 of assessed value, so I'm assuming you can do the math for your own property, you're paying roughly $2,000 a year in property taxes, and that's broken up roughly $400 for municipal functions and $1,600 for state education. Keep on going. All right, so when we're looking at what controls property taxes, grand list growth, this is a chart of grand list growth over the last decade or so. And as a general statement, if the cost of services go up to provide the same level of municipal services, and those costs to provide those services go up at a greater rate than the grand list grows, property taxes are going to increase. You can't have it kind of both ways. Either the property taxes are going to increase, or you're going to have to decrease services if you want to keep the municipal rate or the municipal assessment the same. So over the last 10 years, with some peaks and valleys, the average grand list growth has been about 1.5%. Estimated for 2018, the budget that this, the tax rate that this will support, we're estimating about 0.5%. Okay. Another factor that goes into your property tax is the common level of appraisal, and this is a townwide statistic. So even it is a townwide statistic. Within different neighborhoods, this will maybe vary. It might not be. In certain neighborhoods, you may see different sales data than others, but it is a townwide statistic. And what it shows right now in 2017, currently we're at 96% common level of appraisal. And the important point to note here is that you have to do a reappraisal if your CLA drops below 80%. The select board decided 2 or 3 years ago now to apply functional depreciation to the assessment, which helped quite a bit actually. It stemmed the bleeding. So in my estimate and in the town assessor's estimate, we probably don't need a reappraisal for at least 5 years. So we're doing well with that. But how does this affect your property taxes? So as the CLA decreases, your property tax rate is going to increase. So at 96%, for example, the municipality, Shelburne, we're taxing your homestead to support municipal functions at 4% less than what the state is going to tax you to support the education fund. So, for example, per $100,000 of assessed value, Shelburne, to support municipal functions, will tax you at that 100,000 level. The state is going to tax you at 104,000. So state tax rate will be increased as the CLA goes down. All right, got some of that out of the way. All right, significant costs. So I'm sorry, don't worry, I'll get to it. And again, this budget presentation, the one that I gave to the select board, right now I'm kind of speaking in general terms because nothing has been set with the budget. But this does give you a pretty reasonable overview of where the significant expenditures are. So, police department, roughly 23% of the entire budget is going to go for police services. That includes dispatch, and that also takes out any sort of revenue that we're receiving from fines or from dispatch contracts. So about $2 million of the budget is going to go to support police services. Highway department is the next most significant, about 15%, and then going on down, these are really the major cost items for the budget. And roughly the total expenditure budget, certainly we'll be working on it, could be $100,000 or $200,000, maybe either way, but it's going to be roughly about $8.5 million fiscal year 2019. Okay, so if we look at what this means, not the dollar amount, but what this means for how your property tax bill, it's usually more important or more interesting for people. So if roughly $2,000, if you're paying $2,000 per every 100,000 of assessed value, that's more or less what you're paying. 1,600 of that is going to go to the state education fund. 400 is going to go to municipal operations. Okay, so if we kind of break that up, again, these are rough estimates. Per every $100,000 of assessed value, you're paying $100 for police services for the year. You're paying about $60 for highway department services for the year. 25 or so for the fire department, 25 for library, and then we have departments like recreation and Shelburne Rescue, who are, the recreation department is funded about 50-50 between property taxes and fees. Shelburne Rescue is supported 100% by insurance rebates, so there's no burden for property tax payers to support Shelburne Rescue, for example. All right, so some of the, trying to identify some of the challenges. I'm not going to say that these are all the challenges that the board will face or the public will see. You may decide that other issues are equally or more important than some of the ones that I've identified, but I've looked. So for 2019, so cell tower revenue share, police department, capital improvements and organizational changes, stormwater, emergency dispatch, which we'll talk about later this evening. Debt service with the library project and the Quint coming on board. The library temporary location will be a challenge. Continued volunteer fire department, something that Jerry and I have been working on, and Jerry's going to be presenting his budget not tomorrow, but a week from tonight to the board, and we're putting together some proposals on that. Capital projects that have been funded in past years, but they've been deferred because we've had in order to keep the fund balance healthy and to keep total budget intact, we've had to push back some projects. Right, other challenges will be personnel and benefits, staffing, Bay Road Bridge, and then the various CBC requests. So, you know, this obviously would be easy if during today and tomorrow and next Tuesday, the select board is kind of saying, well, we don't care how much we spend, the property tax can go as high as it wants, and we'll just fund everything. I have a feeling that's not going to be the way it's going to go. So we're going to have to start making some trade-offs between all the things that we want and realistically what can we afford. All right, so going back to some of these challenges. So first is the cell tower share on the water tank. So I've been to Florence, and I've been to Venice, and I've been to the MoMA and the Met and the Shelburne Museum. And I've got to say that the most beautiful painting I've seen is the south water tank. Because for those that don't know, this was a many-year project in the making, and it took basically a full 2 years that I was here to get this completed. But this was a Herculean task to ensure that the water tank is able to survive for another generation, and equally as important, to ensure that cellular antenna service, not just for cell providers that we all use, but also emergency dispatching, is able to continue and actually be done better. But there's a change. So prior to FY 2017, the revenue split, it's about $100,000, a little bit more currently, was 25% would go to the water fund and 75% would go to the general fund. Starting last year, the Water Commission and the Select Board worked together to come up with a program where that money would go from the general fund over to the water fund, but over time, so it wasn't too much of a shock to the budget. So the plan, so the current budget year, it's 60% water fund, 40% general fund. The Water Commissioners have asked the Select Board to move it to 80-20 for FY 2019 with an end goal of having it all eventually. I missed that one up. So sorry, the last line should say 100% water fund and 0% general fund. There you go. All right. Next one, so the police department, came up with an organizational plan. There's also the embedded social worker program that we talked about at the last meeting that the Select Board agreed to fund for at least half a year. That'll come up, and we're also looking at possibility of some capital improvements and some needs down in the police department. This is a photograph I took today, for example, of the locker room space, and I will encourage the members of the public and the Select Board to come and visit the police department anytime during this budget process or anytime you want, and take a facilities tour with me and the chief or the lieutenant or any of the officers as well. All right, stormwater budget. So currently in the proposed FY 2019 budget, to support the stormwater budget, it's going to cost property taxpayers about $8 per 100,000. So what that does not include, and what it really should include, is the capital improvements that are needed to support required, mandated stormwater improvements. And if we were going to fund those, and we should be funding those, although there's no possible way it's going to happen in this year's budget, it would cost another $17 per 100,000. That's just to do what is mandated. So the total burden for stormwater in FY 2019, while it will be around $8, should be $25 per 100,000. So that is why we've been looking at stormwater utility, because for the average household, paying for stormwater through a stormwater utility will be substantially less than if it was on the property tax. And that's because with a stormwater utility, it would be grabbing the non-tax parcels as well as the taxable parcels. So when we're talking about a stormwater utility in the future, the debate is not whether or not we need to do these projects. We have to do the projects. The debate is what is the most fair and equitable and best way to pay for those projects. And the Stormwater Advisory Committee, a meeting or two ago, has informed the Select Board that in their mind, the utility is the appropriate way to go. And we have agreed to work on that more next year. All right, next. So emergency dispatching, this is something we've been talking about, potential changes to a regional approach. It will likely have a budget neutral impact on this year's budget, maybe next year's budget. Long term, it could start bending the curve to reduce costs over the long term, but it'll be a conversation we will be having a lot of, I hope, leading up to town meeting, because this will require a town meeting vote, and we'll talk more about that in a few agenda items. Okay, so these next two slides will go together, and if you had I should say, this budget binder, I'm sorry, anyone who wants all this, A, you can come and see me and look at mine. B, you can come and see me and make copies of all this, and that's fine. I will put most, but definitely not all of this on the website, because that's way too much to put on the website. Some of the most germane information will be on there, line item budgets and presentations, but if you want all the background and all the details, you can come here and we will use the town copy machine, and you can make a copy of anything you want, including this presentation. So the long-term debt, this was last year's, and you're not going to like this graph. So this year's is substantially more, not just this year, but also in the future. And I realize the two graphs, unless you're looking at them, are hard to compare the two. But take my word for it, there is more long-term debt payments owed, not just in FY 2019 relative to what it would have been last year, but also in the next fiscal years. Actually, Fiscal year 2020 and 2021 will be more than the current year, and that's just because the way that the bond bank structures debt repayments. For example, on the library project, it's not the first year that's the most expensive, it's the second year that's the most expensive. So we're still going to be building into paying off the library bond. Okay?
Joe, on that last slide, where did the first block is what year? Or the first block?
Sorry, the first block is FY 2017. The second block is FY 2018, so that's our current year. The third one, with the green starting with the library project. The red here is the Quint, and the green is the library. The blue is all the other existing stuff. You can see that starting in FY 2019, this fiscal year, there's kind of a small amount that's due, relatively small. And then starting in FY 2020 is when the principal payments come due. Okay. All right, another challenge will be the library temporary location. Actually, this should be a budget neutral or even a savings because the cost of renting it, and we've been working on that. The library trustees will talk to the board more tomorrow about this. The savings from energy savings and other savings actually that we pay for the building, it's going to be about neutral cost-wise, but in terms of a sticky wicket or a tough project over the next year, this will be one that will take some time to deal with. Right, next, so we'll talk about this more. I don't want to take Jerry's thunder for 2 weeks from now, but I do want to talk a little bit about the fire department and some of the challenges that we're going to be facing, not just this year, but into the future. And the primary goal that both Chief Ouellette and I think both share, but certainly Chief Ouellette and the fire department, is doing whatever we can to continue the volunteer fire department. Not only is there a significant cost savings to the town by keeping a volunteer department relative to what a career fire department would cost. I mean, at some point in the future, and hopefully we can push it off as long as you can, we're likely at some point there's going to be the need for career firefighting services. Could be 10, could be 20 years in the future, but at some point that is likely going to be a requirement. Chief Ouellette, the officers in the department, Peter and I, we started looking at some proposals that the department had to do what we can to push that off as long as we can, and that will be coming to the board. And so, just want to make a point that one of the goals that we're going to be working on starting this budget year is to keep the volunteer fire department for as long as we can. Because not only is it, again, a cost issue, I think it's also about kind of a culture and heritage as much as of anything, that we want to keep that institution alive for as long as we can. But there's some things that we need to do to keep the incentive alive, I suppose you could say. All right, there's some unfunded capital projects that were put in previous year's budget that we've had to push off, and we can't push them off forever. So I'm just highlighting one. This isn't all of them, but the columns, for example, on the toy store, that's a town building. Those who don't know that, the toy store rents it from the town. But these columns, for example, need to be repaired, and we can't keep pushing them off forever, obviously. So at some point we need to do these projects. And then going back, one of the reasons that we've decided to push off a few of these projects is to keep our fund balance as healthy as possible. I forget what the charter says, 5%? So required to keep 5% in fund balance. The last audited budget, FY 2016, the fund balance is close to 600,000, so we are over that amount, but we've also had to make some decisions on what we're going to do and what we're not going to do to ensure that the fund balance stays healthy. That's important. All right. Other personnel needs that we'll be dealing with, staffing needs through all departments. I would say that just generally speaking, we are operating with as the least amount of staff as we can in Shelburne to provide the services that people are hoping to have. Organizational changes, there's the organizational plan. Of course, that's not written in stone that we've worked on, but we want to start working towards them. Health insurance premiums will increase by 5% or more. And there's a new collective bargaining agreement for the police officers that will be part of this budget. All right, the Bay Road Bridge. So at some point here, the Bay Road Bridge needs to be replaced. There was a bond vote 3 years ago that narrowly was defeated for the replacement of the Bay Road Bridge. Since then, I've been talking to the state. We believe that this bridge will receive state funding, 80 or 90% funding in the next 2 to 5 years. And then probably from the time it's funded through the state, another 2 to 5 years. So it still could be another 10 years until the bridge is replaced. But even at 10 or 20%, the town is going to be on the hook for $300,000 potentially. So we need to start, I think, investing and saving for a new Bay Road Bridge when the time comes. So other challenges, and this is not exhaustive, nor the ones that I went through, but these are CBC, Commission, Board, and Committee requests that have come to the Select Board. So village safety improvements, paths, open space funding, the village dog park, which we know needs to be moved, on the record review and zoning enforcement, technology improvements, the projector, veterans monument maintenance, beach house for the recreation department, and it goes on and on. This is not exhaustive, but there's a lot of requests that have come into the board. I don't know if they've reviewed them all, but there's a lot there, probably more than can be funded. So it'll be a challenge to sift through what are the priorities and where can some compromises be made, or where, how are we going to deal with those? And that will be an absolute challenge for the board, myself, staff, and anyone who is involved in this. All right. So the next steps, like I said, this is an iterative project or process. And so tomorrow there's going to be an all-day budget meeting. And that's when the different CBCs and departments will talk directly to the board. No decisions will be made at that time. But I think hopefully a more complete understanding of the different requests and where we're at will take place. Certainly the public is invited to that. Next week we'll come back. It'll be a special select board meeting just because we canceled the one after Christmas. And the fire department and the rescue department will talk about their budgets specifically with the board, and we'll also start talking about what are the priorities. Then before the new year, and it won't be on New Year's Eve, I will provide the board and the public with the town manager's budget. And then from there, the board in January will work through it. And my experience in these matters is that there's probably 1,000 line items in the budget, maybe a few more, maybe a few less, off the top of his head. And at the end of the day, there's usually about a dozen line items that are points of discussion and points of debate. And I came up with that number off the top of my head, and I looked back at last year, and I put this spreadsheet together for the board to help them work through the items that they were struggling with, and there was exactly 12. So out of this whole budget, $8.5 million, it usually boils down to a dozen, maybe 15 line items that people will be debating and deciding where the priorities are. So I encourage everyone here to stay engaged in the process. I'll certainly do as much as I can to help answer any questions. Peter definitely will as well. And this is the time between now and the end of January for the public to have the most possible say on the budget. Because going back to what I said at the beginning, unlike some other communities, like I said in Heinsberg, where maybe at the town meeting itself, the budget can be altered a little bit, it's a little bit more difficult to do that in Shelburne after the town meeting warning has been set. It's kind of an all or nothing vote at town meeting. So now is the time to have your voices heard and to let the select board and staff know where your priorities are. Hey, I did good. Less than 45 minutes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. That was a great presentation. Very informative.
Well done, Joe.
This is not a time for, we're not making any decisions on the budget now. This is the presentation. And just to give everyone on the board a heads up, and anyone who might decide to come to the meetings tomorrow, neither is tomorrow a time for the select board to be making decisions. Tomorrow is a time where we get information, where we get presentations by all the different departments and the different committees, boards, and commissions. so we can get all the information, think about it, and then in the subsequent meetings, when the budget really becomes within the purview of the select board, that's when the decisions are made, just so people understand the process. But with that said, it is an open public meeting, so does anybody have any comments on Joe's presentation? Other than thanking him? I just thought it was great, Joe. It's nice when the town manager gets.
How about that?
We got it on tape, too.
Very great.
All right, so our next item is item number 6, which is an introduction to proposed amendments to the traffic ordinance to reduce speed limits on portions of Falls and Marsetts Road within Shelburne Village. This is something we've had many discussions
Do you have the visual
on,
here?
and we had a village committee put together. Jerry was on that committee from the board, and we've had a lot of people who've had a lot of good input, and I think we're ready to move forward here. So Joe, why don't I just turn it over to you?
Yeah, and certainly, again, I think this is a good example of democracy being alive and well. I want to thank all the people in the village your committee. It's been a grassroots effort over the last 2 years or so. Certainly my friend Bruce, I don't know if he's here or not, has been a driving force to keep this alive. So I know one of their main goals, not the only goal, and it's a reasonable one, is to have the speed limits reduced on sections of the village roads. And we've been butting our heads against the wall a little bit because it runs up to what we're able to do by state law and what we're not. But a week or two ago, I was on a conference call. Representative Brumstead was on with me with Legislative Council, and we also had someone from VTrans, and I think Jane Zanotti was on with us as well. And the outcome of that conversation is I feel like we can start the ordinance amendment process to reduce the speeds on some sections of the village roads that this group has been advocating for and fighting for. And that if we go through this process, I'm asking for a little extra time, maybe by the end of February, so we can collect all data and make sure that our case is as strong as possible, so that once the ordinance, if the select board agrees to amend the ordinance, that it will then be legally enforceable. Certainly we don't want to be in a situation ever. My main concern is to be in a situation where we're putting our police officers in a position where they can't enforce an ordinance. But the outcome of the call, and Representative Brumstead and Jane were on with me, so they can share what their thoughts were, is that I feel confident now that a lot of the work that we've done over the last year and some of the work that we're hopefully continuing to plan on doing will be favorable enough to show that we have legal authority to make these changes. And so the town charter has a provision where we need to introduce it. So I'm introducing it with not a set recommendation of what the speed limit reduction should be. I would like to come back, probably not next week, but the first meeting in January, with a more concrete proposal of what the reductions in speed should be for a first reading, and then we could warn a public hearing shortly thereafter. But I do think we can move forward on the ordinance amendment process.
Thank you. I want to thank Jessica Brumstead. You've just been fantastic, and thank you very much for not only being our state rep, but working with the town so well. Thank you. One thing, Joe, from my perspective is every year, in March, there's a vote and there's new members on a select board. I think this board is, I'm guessing, is universally supportive of this. I would hate to push this back, and if there's new members on the board who might take time to get up to speed on it, it could pose a problem. So when we set this schedule, and so people understand, amending an ordinance under statute requires the same process as passing an ordinance. So we have the introduction, as Joe said, a first reading, a second reading, and a public hearing. Now, the second reading, the public hearing can take place immediately after the second reading, the same meeting. But I just don't want to put us in a position, if we're, push it back anymore, we got to be done in February.
No,
in other words.
absolutely. I mean, some of it I want to have a little bit of a slower process, but to get done in February, just so we can collect the data and that we are going to need to ensure it be as enforceable and legal as possible. So, but certainly by the end of February, maybe earlier, we'll be able to have it all wrapped up.
Great. Does anyone on the board have something? I know, Jerry, you've been so involved, so please.
Well, there are lots of people to thank. Jane and Tom and several members of the committee who are here, Doris, certainly Jessica, and but most of all, to thank a gentleman whose middle name has turned out to be Patience, and for whom we probably should designate a section of that road in his honor. But Bruce, we're all in your debt for your call, early and loud and sincere and genuine and backed up by data, by a tremendous amount of information that all of us have been introduced to, and at risk of jinxing what is a super initiative by Joe, I think it's appropriate to salute you. So
I agree.
But it's not about me, it's about the town and what's best and what's safe. So I appreciate that, but I just would really love to see this happen.
I will tell everyone from a historical perspective, I've been on the board 9 years now, and for the first 5 years, we had a different town manager, and we were told this could not be done, and Joe would not give up. And Joe has worked very hard, I think, with this group.
absolutely.
And
yeah.
Our town manager deserves a lot of credit for bringing us to the precipice. Messed that one up. The brink of hopefully having something positive happen on this. So I really commend Joe for this.
Yeah.
Oh, twice in one
Jane,
meeting.
Yes, please. So we're going to have some, anybody can have a comment. Remember, I do think that we're going to be looking to going forward. So it's, how the salesman says, once you get the yes. If you could just please, everyone, come to the microphone, identify yourself. And maybe we can move the mic back. Is that okay if we move it back to the center? Yeah.
I have my steps in.
We have Dancing with the Stars.
Thank you, Susan McClellan, Falls Road. And I'm hoping that if this does go through, that it will be enforced. Because the speed limit that's there now is not being enforced. And I think this led to this whole pedestrian committee because it's not being enforced.
I think you make a really good point, and that's one of the things Joe was talking about. There's a couple of elements to a speed limit. It's not just changing the ordinance, amending the ordinance to change it. You have to have the data to support it so the police department can enforce the new speed limit. So that's what Joe's trying to do
Well, why
there.
can't they enforce the old one, too?
Well, that's a very good point.
You
It's a
know,
very
I
good
mean,
point,
we have
and
35 in front of my house, I don't feel is unreasonable. Down by Bruce's, yes, it is unreasonable, I think. So I think depending on where we're at along the corridor, I think enforcement is a big deal, too.
I think you make good points, Susan. Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone else on the board who would like to speak on this?
No.
So, okay, from a process standpoint, Joe, what do you recommend then? You recommend that we not set a first reading, because that means we have to wait till our next meeting in order to set a first meeting. We can, first reading, we can always set the first reading
I think we should
and continue it.
I think we should set it for the first meeting in January.
Yeah.
Okay, and should we then set the,
Right now, let's just set the first one, and then from there, we'll set the second in public hearing.
okay, so
You need a motion
I
to-
entertain, oh, wait a second, Jessica would like to speak.
I just want to reinforce what Joe's saying, because the two pieces of advice that we got were really from Ledge Counsel, the lawyer at Ledge Counsel who just does transportation. She's excellent. She did a huge amount of research on the statute, found that a lot of the things that we believed in the past are not in law, and so we should be able to enforce this. But also, VTrans came on, who was a little more of a downer, and they said
Shocking.
we needed a little more data And we know exactly what that data is that we need. So it's really important that we get that data so we won't have any questions. And so I agree with Joe, whatever.
Good. So Joe, do you have an idea of how long it would take to get that data?
I think that we'll certainly be able to have it ready for a public hearing in late February or in early February by the very latest. I mean, you know, the budget process is going to suck up some time right now.
And
but
the first meeting in January, is that January 9th?
yes. So if we do a first reading on January 9th, then I think from there we'll know what the timeline is moving forward.
All right, I'd entertain a motion for a first reading for proposed amendments to the traffic ordinance to reduce speed limits on portions of Falls and Marsetts roads within Shelburne Village.
So move.
Moved by Josh. Is there a
Second.
second? By Jerry. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye. All right, unanimous. Thank you
Chris.
again, everyone,
Thanks,
for all
Jim.
your work, and thank you to those special people. Okay. Next item is item number 7, discuss Union Municipal District Agreement for Chittenden County Regional Dispatch. And Joe, I'm just going to turn this right over to you.
Okay. All right. I guess I'm going to. Can you just put it on slide 3? Okay. You can't see that great. So we've been, don't worry about too much about the slide. I'm not going to flip through slides. So we're at a point here. I'm speaking to the select board and to the public. The select board it's been one of the goals that I've had, I think, at least since I started, or at least the last 2 years for sure, that the board has appointed me and had me continue to work with a countywide group to look at the possibility of a regional dispatch entity. And I've come back and reported a few different times to you. The last time, well, if you recall, it was either August or September, and that was a time when we were finalizing a draft of a charter to send to the Attorney General's office for their review. Jerry made a few good comments that were incorporated into the final draft of the charter that went to the Attorney General's office. It has since come back, and now it's in your budget binders, the charter and some of the background information. And it's the same version that's for all the Chittenden County communities to consider putting this as a town meeting warning in March. So I'm going to stop there, but talk a little bit about, I'm not going to go into details. I feel like I've probably given a regional dispatch presentation enough times where I can wake up in the middle of the night and start talking about dispatch at this point. But I do want to talk a little bit about this in general terms to the people listening and the select board, because we have some time to talk about the nuances of the charter and things like that. And that's not the purpose tonight, but I do want to kind of talk about the theory of this. So, and I'll be the first to say that, dispatching, it's not like it's not working now. There's no question that it's working well now, in fact. And I am certainly, especially after I just got done telling you, talking about a local budget, and I'm certainly a local government guy, I also have concerns about regionalizing services and adding new layers of government and a new entity that doesn't have the oversight. These regional entities absolutely do not have the oversight that a municipal budget has, for example, municipal services. I mean, not this many people show up to any of the CWD meetings or CCTA or any of the other ones. I mean, that's just a fact that expanding layers of government, I don't know if that's the best thing. I don't think that regionalizing services is appropriate for everything that we do by any means. I think that local control is important. I would not necessarily favor regionalizing fire services or police services or some other things, even stormwater. I have some concerns about. But regional dispatch, I do think, is different. And this has been something that's been studied in Chittenden County and identified since 1967 as the preferred way of providing this service. And a lot of things that we talk about here, they're all important, a lot of things that come before the board, but I want to be clear, this is a life and death issue. This is not government theory. This is not, you know, how many agenda items should we have? And those are all important conversations. But this, I hope, is why people came into public service in the first place. And I'm not advocating and saying that you know, it should definitely be regional services. People here need to make up their minds about the best way to provide the service. But we're talking about life and death service. Dispatching is fundamental to providing all of our emergency services. Without a dispatcher, cops can't do their job, firefighters can't do their job, EMTs can't do their job. If you are having a bad day, you want to call 911 and you want to know that you're getting service as quickly as possible. And that's what this comes down to, is how do we get the right people, whether it's Chief Lamette or firefighters or cops, to the place in need as quickly as possible. And Shelburne specifically, relative to other communities in Chittenden County, is extremely well served with the current setup. In Shelburne, you are living in the best possible world, because Shelburne Dispatch does dispatch and is part of the 911 call taking. So if, God forbid, there's a problem at your house and you call 911 and things are working right with the 911 system, you're getting service immediately if you are in Shelburne. So if you put your Shelburne only hat on, the difference in service by going to a regional entity is probably minimal. But that's only true if you never leave Shelburne. If you go to Burlington for a UVM game, or if you work at the hospital, or if you're on Church Street or anywhere else in Burlington or South Burlington or somewhere else, all of a sudden the game has changed for you. And the service that you would be getting is not as good. And you would lose time in the response that you would receive from emergency services. One of the reasons is because the 911 system in Chittenden County right now is bifurcated between Shelburne Dispatch and Williston State Police. And then every municipality has their own dispatching service, and so calls get transferred. I could kind of go into more details than I'm going to go in now, but I will in the future, especially if it's asked. And these calls get transferred all over the place, and time is lost. Time is not lost if you call Shelburne Dispatch, because that 911 call is automatically be taken by a Shelburne dispatcher, and the police and the fire are running out to your place, and that's good. You want to be in Shelburne if things don't happen well. But like I said, that's not the case if you're working in Burlington, or if you're at a game in Burlington, or if you're at a kids event in South Burlington or Williston or anywhere else. All of a sudden, you're not as well served. Regional dispatching will serve the community, the entire region, better, more effectively. Regional dispatching is the way this sort of service is provided nationwide. We're hardly going to be blazing a new trail in Chittenden County if we do this. It's going to be more efficient. It's going to be more effective. There's going to be drawback, benefits, and negatives, just like anything else. But we've looked at this for 2 years with the current group. It's been studied for over 50 years in the past. And at least in my conclusion is that regional dispatching is hands down the most effective way to provide this service to the most amount of people in this area. The details of the union municipal agreement we can talk about over the next 2 months, and then the select board will certainly be asked at the end of January, just like the budget, to put this on the warning for town meeting vote. If it goes to town meeting vote and voters vote for it, that doesn't mean that we automatically start a regional entity. They would take another action by the board to then join the regional entity. So creating it at town meeting, or the possibility of creating it, is not the same as it will happen. Also, for example, if Shelburne does not vote to start the regional entity, that doesn't mean that it won't start. All it takes is 2 communities in Chittenden County to vote yes, and then it would start. And then the future would happen. Maybe Shelburne would join it later, or maybe not at all, or something like that. Or I'm not sure what would happen. But I think that's hopefully a reasonable introduction to dispatching for right now. And I can go into all the gory details in the future, and we can talk about it. And I hope we do talk about it, because this is an important service. And whether you think it's better provided the way it is, or it's better provided from a regional entity, this is a life and death issue in my opinion, and not my opinion, it is a life and death issue, and it should be considered strongly by the members of the board and the public.
Thank you, Joe, and you're right. You could speak about this in the middle of the night. Does anyone on the board have any comments? This is not a decision item tonight. And by the way, just to stress, what we're talking about, Joe mentioned it, is, but I'd just like to focus a bit. It's to consider warning an article for town meeting to establish a union municipal district for dispatch. It's not for us to join it. So that would take a separate vote in the future.
Correct.
So, absolutely, Ken, just come to the microphone, please. Ken Albert.
Ken Albert, trying to understand. So right now, if you're in Burlington and there is an emergency there, or in one of the other towns that's not Shelburne, it will go to either Shelburne or Williston?
No.
That's not, in other words, what my question is, do we now not have a regional? What do we have right now?
That map is, I think, accurate. It's fuzzy.
It
So
looks like there's a region there. So
yeah. So the dark purple.
I don't quite understand.
Let me go. It's hard to have it both ways. You either have to explain all the way, or I'll try to be brief, and I would maybe at a future meeting go into more detail.
Sure.
And Jessica's heard this too many times, so I won't go and point at it. But the dark purple. Sorry, Gary, that's not gonna help you out much.
Come on, jump over it.
Would you like me to point here?
No, it's all I got it. I think I can handle it. Dark purple. Nope. See, now I know I messed it up already. No, so the dark purple is this one. Is that blue? Oh boy. All right, that's the one I'm talking about.
I'm colorblind. I can't see any of it.
This map shows how the 911 system in Vermont works right now. There are 6 PSAP stations. PSAP stands for Public Safety Answering Point, 911 call center. Okay, and so this is Shelburne Dispatch is one of the 6. So we as a municipality are an essential part of providing 911 service for the entire state. Good job. So Burlington is up here in the blue. The blue is part of the Williston State Police section. So that entire blue is covered by Williston State Police as their primary 911 answering point. So if you need to call 911 in Burlington, that call, assuming everything, will go to Williston State Police. And then unlike what I just described in Shelburne, where if you call from Shelburne and the 911 caller taker is the Shelburne dispatcher, automatic move. Now the Williston State Police 911 call taker needs to phone over to Burlington Dispatch and send someone out to you. So there's a transfer there that happens that we're trying to ease that. Now, sorry, Ken, you opened up a little bit of a can. So the interesting thing, though, and the dispatchers can certainly come up and talk more, is that let's say, I'm just making something up here. Let's say we have 2 911 or 2 dispatchers on duty. I don't know if we have 2 or 3 now, or how many we have on. Let's just say we have 2, and let's say they're both on a call. All of a sudden, your perfect world in Shelburne isn't quite as perfect, because now your call in the 911 system, it doesn't go to the next closest geographical area. It actually goes to the 911 call taker on the system who's gone the longest without taking a call. So it could be any one of the areas. So let's pretend that it goes to transferred down or up here to St. Albans 911. Now the St. Albans 911 call taker is taking it, but now they have to phone back to Shelburne Dispatch on a different line, and the Shelburne dispatcher is going to take it over here and send out the right person for you. So there's some logistics that, I wouldn't say that it doesn't work now. It does. I mean, and we've had plenty of success stories where we we've done some great, but we think it can be done more efficiently, more effectively through a regional entity.
So you're saying when you're up in Newport, you're really calling Williston to get a dispatcher up in Newport?
If you have to call 911, yes, that's right.
Yeah, that happened to me last week when I called in I was one of the many that called in the Larson fire. And I dialed 911 and I got someone somewhere who said, we'll send you to, we'll connect you to.
Yeah. And there's some communities, for example, that a 911 dispatcher would have to call a 911 call taker, this isn't Shelburne, but there are some communities that a 911 call taker needs to call 3 different dispatching organizations because a different dispatcher sends out the state police, the rescue, and the fire. So it's kind of a odd situation right now. Again, is regionalizing the magic bullet? No, but we think that it's a better solution. Chief Omet can speak when Chief Omet went. He's used to seeing how regional dispatching worked from New York and some others. So we're trying to make the service work a little bit better.
Gail, if you could just grab the mic.
It still feels confusing when I look at the map. It looks like there are regions there, so how would regionalization look different?
That's the current map. So if Shelburne joins, and possibly even if we don't, but if Shelburne joins, we would be then transferring our PSAP to the regional PSAP. So all of a sudden, Chittenden County, instead of being bifurcated the way it is, would be covered all under one PSAP center. So that's the current setup with the 6 different regions. The new regional entity would include all of Chittenden County. So Chittenden County would have one primary PSAP center. So that would be the change. Yeah, well, so that's another interesting part of all this. Currently, dispatching region-wide is both, in a sense, overstaffed and understaffed. Overstaffed in the sense that at any given time, there's 8 or 9 dispatchers on at any given time. But except for Shelburne, oftentimes, like in Colchester or some of the other places, there's one dispatcher on. So, I mean, they're literally taking the phone to the restroom with them because they can't leave. And if they're on a call with someone, automatically they can't be on a call with someone else. So there's 8 or 9 dispatchers on region-wide. But, for example, so we're overstaffed in that regard, or we're understaffed in that regard. But, for example, the entire city of Boston has 5 on at any time. So the city of Boston, which compared to Chittenden County is 5 or 6 times more population, has 3 less dispatchers on at any given time. But if you put them all under one roof, you're kind of maximizing the redundancy in a way that we are not doing right now. So.
Thank you. Jessica?
That's the piece that really got me, was that now they will be together. There's a relationship piece too, where they can learn from each other and talk to each other instead of being all alone in Newport or wherever, taking a call. And even if they're just a little confused, it's nice to have another person, another body, I think, is an important piece. And there'll be more of an ability to move up, to not just be at that level. You can
it's more of a career track.
Yeah, so there's a little more of a career track. So.
Well, it's a more efficient sharing of local knowledge too.
Yeah.
Since they're going to represent various areas in the region.
All right. Does anyone else have any comments, Dr. Metz?
Well, it means massive training of the dispatchers because they'll have the need to know a lot more, have a lot more resources quickly at hand. Yeah, and I say that from my own experience as being responsible for safety on the Great Lakes, the entire Great Lakes, and with one center.
Yeah, and actually, Shelburne dispatchers will have a. Shelburne dispatchers are the only dispatchers amongst Chittenden County municipal dispatchers that are 911 certified. So actually other dispatchers are going to have to learn what Shelburne is doing currently.
All right, thank you, Joe. Our next item is item number 8. It's listed as a decision item. Consider select board action and decision on the hillside sewer issue. We've had this issue before us a few times. Now, we put together a group of people. Jamie from the select board worked with Joe and Peter and Chris and some others. They prepared a memo which has been placed on the website and available in the email distribution list, and which included some facts and then a recommendation by Jamie. And I think it's fair for everyone to know that I think there might be some different opinions on this. But why don't I turn it over to Jamie, and I just also, just as an intro, want to thank you for stepping in, and the memo was great, and I know Chris had a lot to do with it, he always does, but thank you.
The whole team did, collective effort, thank you all. So I was appointed on the 21st to sort of help, I think, two pieces here. It was really to aggregate the facts. I think we were receiving a lot of different information from various points and just put it all in one place so that we could all look at it. And then the second piece was to come up with a recommendation. So I'll just, since we have 10 minutes on this item, I'll hit the highlights. The memo's about 4 or 5 pages. The board's received it. Hopefully the affected residents have had a chance to review it. What we did in the first section here was just try to recount the facts here. I won't go into detail, but the incident happened on June 30th, 2017, at, I believe, 4 residences on Hillside Terrace. Essentially what happened is there was an extreme rain event, and a piece of concrete from inside one of the manholes had dislodged at some point in time. We don't know when necessarily, but the concrete piece blocked the outgoing pipe. As a result, there was a sewage backup into these residences. So from there, I wanted to just point out that there's been ongoing testing here from the town, and I tried to capture that at the bottom of page 1 there. Our engineering firm, Aldrich and Eldred and Elliott, has been retained to evaluate the capacity of the overall collection system. I think this was one question that came in at a previous meeting. Chris is here and can speak more to the ongoing testing. The response itself, really wanted to just call out that the town's response, based on my meetings with the team here, as well as just the documentation I've seen, was essentially best in class. The town did everything that it could under the circumstances. As soon as the incident was reported, Chris's team was there at the homes, and as a result, claims were filed with VLCT Passive. Determination came back that there was no fault on the town's side, and as a result, the no-fault coverage, which is an extra layer of coverage that the town has through its passive policy, was triggered, and we made claims under that policy. As out of an abundance of caution, maybe you can speak to this here, we actually went back to passive and asked for a reconsideration. In other words, take a second look at the facts here and just reconfirm that this is actually a no-fault incident, and the reconsideration came back confirming that initial determination, which was just validated the initial call there. A little bit of history on the second page here with the system. Won't go into detail on this other than just to call out that there's ongoing testing here. Flow capacity, there's a collection of data that will continue over the next month or two, just to really help us zero in on the flow capacity itself. The obligation was the next section I looked at, was to really come back with a recommendation of, does the town have an affirmative obligation here? What I did was somewhat limited. I took a look at the sewer ordinance, had not spent much time with that, by the way, so that was a good document to get grounded in. I didn't see anything in there that would trigger an obligation on behalf of the town to respond with, let's say, reimbursement. of the residents under these circumstances. The one piece that I did want to flag for the board here is that I really we didn't do as a town much in the way of asking the town's attorney to take a look at this, but I think it's important just for the board to recognize that VLCT Passive's attorney has weighed in on this, and Peter's been privy to that communication. I believe the board has seen that, but there was correspondence from Passive's attorney. But I did just want to make it clear that I did not speak to Brian or the town's attorney about this matter, and I know that was a question maybe in some board members' minds. So the residents asks here, there are 3 affected residents from what I understand, 4 total, one of whom has a claim that is fully covered by the passive coverage, so we sort of set that individual aside for the time being, since there's ongoing, perhaps a coverage dispute there that will sort of take its own course. 3 homeowners who have provided a request for reimbursement, which has been attached to the memo. They vary a bit. The offer from VLCT Passive was highlighted here. The town, for everybody's awareness, the no-fault aggregate is a $30,000 annual policy. So based on a calendar year, as soon as you use that up, it's exhausted. We had $30,000 as of December, call it. So the proposal here was for $7,500 per homeowner from Passive. That's still on the table. I understand that Passive has worked with the residents on a proposed release, and that's still under consideration by the residents. So, but I did want to just make the board aware that that's part of the overall response here, or package, so to speak. Now we get to my recommendation. As I thought about this, I've heard the residents for a couple meetings here. I've heard members from the public speak to this. I had a chance to think about it. Obviously met with town staff here, had a chance to sort of look at and better understand just the sewer fund itself. And I was careful to really try to think about how do we address this and try to, at some level, resolve it, while at the same time being very cognizant of the fact that there's an obvious slippery slope here, right? As soon as we start paying funds out of, whether it's the sewer fund or elsewhere, in a general fund, for example, you open the door at some level to claims, and that was a concern for me. So I wanted to really try to paint a box around what we were trying to do here, and I pulled myself away from focusing on a pure legal framework and instead try to think of it more as just an equitable settlement more than anything. And my recommendation here was, based on what I saw from the residents and thinking of the $7,500 passive offer, as well as what the quote-unquote gap or balance was, which ranged from about $1,000 up to $3,100 for one of the residents. My suggestion was that an amount not to exceed $3,500 per claim as a supplemental emergency fund be extended, and that offer would be conditioned upon execution of a release. There were a couple things that I also thought were important to call out. The residents all had appropriate homeowners coverage. They had backflow preventers. They were doing what would be expected of a homeowner at any point in time who's using the system. So with that, I'll take a pause and put it back to the board for consideration.
Thank you, Jamie. You did a lot of work. I'm very interested. I'd like to turn it over to the board, but also I'd like to hear, if I could, from Joe and Chris and Peter, what their thoughts about this, because what this would be doing, in essence, is making the town a self-insurer for when there are times when we are not negligent, because that's a key here. There's been no showing that the town has been negligent. So if we go down this path, and if people want to go down this path, I mean, we can go down this path, but it's something that we should be aware of, because we're setting a precedent that we are now being self-insured. And so we have these claims now. The next time there's an issue, if there's no negligence on the part of the town, and the damage is $90,000, then we have a real potential issue. And that's one of the things that I personally am struggling with, you know, because I think you used a great phrase, an equitable resolution. You know, we're neighbors, okay? We're neighbors, and I think most people want to help people. At the same time, if we enter into the realm of being a self-insurer, we're opening the town up. So I'd be interested in what Chris and Joe and Peter think about this, and then turn it over to the select board and everyone else. So
I could start just with a few thoughts, and just to pick up a few things I think are important. One is to give a lot of, just another reason to commend Peter, is that it was only thanks to his forward thinking many years ago that the town selected insurance coverage that included no fault. I mean, if it wasn't for Peter thinking about this years and years ago, we wouldn't even have the $30,000. And so since then, we've also increased it to $40,000. So we've, you know, that was a plus.
And that's just so everybody knows, that's the max
the
that's
max.
available. And I know some residents have asked, you know, why don't you just take out more coverage? Well, it's not available. So that's sort of a simple answer to that.
And then second of all, it's a little bit of a kind of an irony and a twist of fate, is the way I phrased it, or Jamie and I phrased it in this memo. But it's if the town was not managing, and if Chris and his staff were not managing the sewer system professionally, appropriate, documented, the coverage would actually apply. One of the reasons that this is a no-fault coverage is because staff in the town have been managing it, and it's documented that we're managing the system to best practices. So, you know, in a sense, these folks would be better off if we were not doing that, because the insurance coverage would probably kick in. So I just want to make that point. I mean, it's good news, bad news, but and Chris probably can talk a little bit more about the system in general, especially around Hillside.
this is Chris Robinson. He's in charge of our sewer.
Chris Robinson. The history of the system, I've been with the town for 20 years, and the only event that I'm aware of was the event that we had back in 2013 that affected one resident, and that was an unusual circumstance. I believe we received something like 5 inches of rain within a matter of 3 or 4 hours. It was a huge downpour, inundated the system. We're finding that a lot of our system the flow that's going into the system is actually coming from private property. It's coming from people's sump pumps, perimeter drains they may have connected to our system, things like that. Our system itself is pretty tight, so we're not receiving a lot of infiltration and inflow coming into our system, our system. It's coming from private property, which becomes a very large resource task to try to get out there, knocking on individual homes and everything else to try to find these. The incident we just had in 2017 was a combination of a blockage, plus we had a rain event. And I believe eventually the blockage would have blocked it completely. We would have had some kind of a backup. But because of the rain event, it just inundated it. I believe if the blockage wasn't there, the flow would have flowed perfectly fine and we would have been okay. Because there was a blockage, it caused things to back up. What we've done to correct that is we've done a permanent fix to the manhole. It's a structural repair. It's good for the next 20, 30 years. And we've, as Joe had mentioned, or Jamie had mentioned, that we have contacted Aldrich and Elliott, and in fact tomorrow they should be out there doing some surveying for manholes to develop pipe sizes and slopes to determine what the flow capacity is of that system. And then based on the number of residences and businesses that are tied into it, they'll come up with just a on-paper calculation of what the flow should be going down through that and see whether or not that's adequate. The long term will be actually setting flow meters in there, and that's going to be a matter of maybe 5-6 months out before we're going to be able to gather that data and then analyze it. But we'll put flow meters in the structures and measure the actual flow during rain events, during everything, to find out what we're getting for peak flows in that system. Granted, it's still a short period of time, say 6 months. It's not over years, but we will gather that information and see whether or not it's adequate. And the engineers have a way to throw peaking factors in there and stuff like that, so we should be able to come up with whether or not that system is adequate for the service area. So we'll find that out when they get done the final evaluation. But we should have some kind of a rough idea within the next month or so of approximately what the flow is. That's a theoretical calculations of what that flow should be.
Chris, one suggestion I mentioned to Joe was just to make this ongoing testing data and available to the public somewhere where it's readily accessible on the website, so that folks don't need to chase Joe or you or
absolutely
anyone else.
Anytime
So
we
it's
get a
central
report
and,
from the engineers and stuff,
right.
I can definitely get that posted.
Yeah, that would be great if that's
on the website.
easy to find for residents. That would be helpful.
Yep.
Okay, thanks for the technical aspect of it. Peter, I was wondering if you had any thoughts you wanted to weigh in. One of the things I'm also interested in knowing is anyone aware of other Vermont towns who have chosen to become self-insured in regard to sewer when there's no negligence on behalf of the town?
We did not reach out to the league to get that information, so obviously we think it makes sense to have the no-fault coverage, and unfortunately 40,000 is the maximum. I really can't add much more than what's already been discussed, other than there may be some differences in what we're calling the total damage. That was a calculation our insurance company did. We're not in the insurance business, so we went with their numbers, and that may be a difference between what the property owners have come up with, but our feeling was to, if we had had the coverage, that's how it would have been handled, so that's how we determined the damages that were listed here. I mean, as far as how you handle the balance, again, you've outlined the pros and cons, and that's the part we're struggling with. So.
Peter, what's the annual cost of the no-fault insurance?
I don't have that number. I know we increased it. It was $1,000 or so to go from 30 to 40,000, but the latest premium didn't have that broken out, so I don't have.
I mean, is it tens of thousands?
No, I would no.
It's probably about 4,000 if it's 1,000 to go up. 10,000, it's probably 4,000 for the entire 40. Jerry.
Yeah, first I want to thank, of course, Peter and Chris and Joe and Jamie certainly for a really solid piece of work that's understandable and thoughtful, and I greatly appreciate that. While I support this award, let's call it, I do think we need to be attentive to precedent. But I'm wondering if we choose not to describe this as supplemental insurance, in effect, which leads to discussions of self-insurance, why don't we potentially call this a grant? Just a simple grant based on the need of some of our neighbors who've spent some months with this problem, in which case we at least make a point of saying that this is not the derivative of the failure of an insurance amount to adequately cover, but is a grant supplement to ease the burden that these families are experiencing. And I wonder if maybe some simple language change in how we're describing this might ease our obligations on another case, similar case, in which case we would make determinations based on need.
I mean, I'm fine with playing around with the words. I think if we call it I call it a supplemental emergency fund. You can sort of characterize it however you want to, but in my mind, I'm not sure certainly some concern about precedent, but no different than if we have a notice of violation for a zoning issue that we decide to settle as opposed to take to court, right? I mean, in some ways, it's a settlement of a claim, not through the court system necessarily, but through our own means.
Sure.
And I mean, another piece for me was the sewer fund balance is healthy, and we could certainly have a broader conversation about how are we thinking about that fund and how is it allocated and where are the future needs and how does this emergency bucket fall into that broader?
Yeah, good point.
I think you make a good point that the sewer fund balance is healthy, but at the same time, we should also be aware that we have some of the highest sewer rates in Chittenden County. So
We do, second highest.
Second highest, okay, that's some of the highest. I think it's a great idea that you're trying to avoid setting something up to be a precedent, but perhaps it's really form over substance here.
Yeah,
That's what we're doing.
I appreciate that.
And also, one of the concerns, if we were to go ahead and do this, do we then need to amend the ordinance to provide for this? We have a sewer ordinance. So do we then need to change it to provide for a supplemental emergency fund? And again, we're going down the path of self-insurance.
Yeah, I mean,
and if that's what we want to do, I'm not going to say no. I'm just saying we should be aware. This is a potential huge matter for the sewer users, and please don't be mistaken. This is not from the property tax. This is from the people who pay into the sewer fund, all the people on sewer.
To your point about the ordinance, I think it's worth a fresh look, honestly. It's dated and probably needs some eyes on it at some point. I don't know if we amend it to reflect an emergency fund necessarily, but one call out I had as part of my recommendation was for us as a town to just think about a more formal policy, maybe
Joe,
to address
I sent an email
future incidents.
to you too. Do any of these people need a place to stay in the meantime if there's a backup? Okay, because I'll tell you right up front, my wife was in the back offered to open our house to people, so if somebody needs something.
That's not the issue.
Okay, I just didn't know if that was part of it.
I mean, I guess, and Jamie knows this from meeting with staff, and I imagine this would be the same response any staff would give the board, that I think we're queasy or hesitant at best, because these claims are not enormous, I suppose, but the next one could be $100,000 for sure. And so, this absolutely is an unfortunate situation. There's no doubt. Everyone feels bad. So you're never going to have a staff that's going to recommend to the board to kind of open this up. So I guess if you do move forward with this, I hope you do so, I guess, in the narrowest possible way. And then it probably makes sense to at least develop a policy. And that's not going to happen with this before March, I don't think.
So that was actually my question is if we're concerned about setting a precedent, how can we narrow the view as much as possible? And I don't know if you can. And does this precedent, would it also apply to other areas of the town and other services that we provide? Like highway, road clearance, accidents that aren't covered by...
Could.
I mean, I guess any resident can make a request for anything they want, right, to the board, and this was an incident that had a broader impact. It wasn't a one-off resident making a claim about a tree falling on their house, let's say. I think that's their prerogative to make a claim, and we can respond however it's appropriate in my mind, whether it's a 100K claim or if it's a more modest number. I don't know how to address the painting a box around it other than...
No, we would. I think it's fair to say we would be setting
a big decision, and I think you're right to
we would be setting a precedent here, and maybe it's a precedent that the board wants to set. Yeah. I do like your phrase at the beginning, equitable resolution. They are our neighbors, and sometimes boards step out of the box to do what they believe is the correct thing to do, and maybe this is one of those times. But it's it's potentially a large assumption. So let's turn it over to people oh, wait, before I turn it over, Josh wants to say something.
I just wanted to follow up on the discussion, because I think one of the things that Jamie said, I thought was really significant, in that your reading of the ordinance says that the town really has no responsibility for the, am I saying that correctly?
I didn't see anything in there. Again, it's me reading it, and I didn't see any affirmative indemnity obligation or anything that
Right. And that, I mean, I find that sort of, interesting in itself, because I think, I would think, and I think it's been mentioned by people from the public as well, is that even though this, from what Chris has said and what we've learned, this is a rare event. I mean, we've got good management of this, but I think it is different from a lot of other things, in that sewage in your basement is drastically different than a lot of other things that could happen. And so the idea that the town has sort of limited responsibility for sewage in your basement, I think might rub people sort of the wrong way, so to speak. And so given that, and being very cognizant of the concerns about precedent, and even though I'm not sure I would call it self-insurance per se, I mean, if there is a mechanism to sort of on an annual basis contribute funds to a separate reserve that could deal with these things over time, we might have $100,000, which could be used or not. But it would just provide that measure of security, so to speak, so people wouldn't be in this situation. I don't know if I would call it necessarily self-insurance per se, and maybe there would be a cap on the amount that would be available for things. But at least given the way we do things, it seems like that would be something to be considered, just to provide that extra margin of safety for people who would not like to go to their basement and find a surprise.
Yeah, but we're talking about when there's no negligence on the
I'm
part.
not, and I'm not talking about I'm not talking about, you can call it whatever you want, but I'm just saying, I'm just talking about it from a purely practical, what are the town's responsibility, and what do the residents, what are the users of this wastewater system,
do you believe if we gradually put more money in to $100,000 you mentioned, isn't that really completely self-insurance?
You can call it whatever you'd like to call it.
Well, what else would you call it?
I would call it I think Jamie called it an emergency fund, or something else that would essentially provide a backup. And it doesn't necessarily create the precedent, as you say, that yes, all your claims are covered, but at least it gives us that flexibility to say, yeah, this can happen. But Chris,
I'm sure you can tell how it wouldn't set a precedent.
I'm not sure what where you want to describe that precedent. All I'm saying
I'm just trying to understand, if the town is not negligent and we are covering losses for people, and how is that not setting a precedent going forward? And maybe we should be setting a precedent.
I'm talking specifically for the wastewater system. I'm not sure, and I think if, as Jamie says, if we look at the ordinance and we have a sewer ordinance which is separate from everything else, it's limited to that. Any other kind of issue would stand on its own in another area. Here I'm talking about sewage in people's basements.
Chris, I think you picked the microphone up. You're probably ready to speak.
Yeah, I just want to give a kind of a quick overview of typically what happens in our system. We probably respond to about a dozen calls a year for sewer backing up into people's homes, not necessarily flooding their basements, but let's say the toilets aren't flushing down in their basement very well, or they're getting issues. And when we respond, I would probably say 90% of those issues are not in the town's line. They're in the private sewer laterals that the owner themselves have.
Yeah.
I think, and I'm not an insurance specialist and all that type of stuff, but you got some disparity when you look at what people have for coverage for their own homes, because it could be their own lines that back up into their homes, and then they have to go to their homeowner's insurance for coverage. A lot of times you see people with unfinished basements have the same coverage as people that have got a $70,000 finished basement. I think where there seems to be a lack is adequately insuring what you actually have down there, and a lot of times people don't think of that. I mean, as a homeowner myself, I wouldn't think of that. I would assume, you know, I've got homeowners insurance, it's going to cover it, but usually it's a special rider that you have on your coverage. So, but I just wanted to let you know it's not always a town issue. A lot of times it's a private issue.
And
so.
I think that's a great point to think, and I think this is almost is like a package of, as Jamie says, looking at the wastewater ordinance to essentially put all of these bits and pieces together, and maybe as part of an educational program, and just sort of getting people to recognize what the town's responsibility are what the homeowners' responsibilities are, and just make sure that, I mean, I think this goes back to, you know, essentially the health and welfare issue of trying to make sure that we are working in the best interest of the users of the system.
Okay, we have a bunch of people who want to speak, so Susan, why don't we start with you? Chris, I started with you the last time.
Susan McClellan, Falls Road. Number one, I think one thing you're missing about this isn't the first time this has happened to these people. They've had multiple issues. Jan, this is what, number 4 for you?
It's 2 during my residency, one in the 1970s, and I believe one in the 1990s, but I can't confirm that.
So, you know, this isn't the first time for many of these people, which leads me to think that this isn't an issue from their house to the hookup or anything. I mean, there's got to be a problem down there that's not being dealt with. And if everything is running so smoothly and beautifully, why have we had these incidences of dumping into Lake Champlain?
Okay, thank you. Chris? Nice
Before
sweatshirt.
things get too lost in who's responsible and what precedents get set, the bottom line, when you're sitting there, think about if you were sitting here. So, the big difference, and I believe you touched on it, Chris, very well, the problem wasn't in their lateral. The problem was in the main. For whatever reasons, there may have been no fault, but the problem was in the main that backed into their lateral. It would seem the town can do something.
So you believe the town should be responsible when the town is not at fault? I'm just trying to understand.
It's in the town's main.
I know, but I'm asking if the town's not at fault.
So I understand there's no fault, but it seems like the town should be able to help, being as, even though the circumstances were unusual, it was on the town's end where the backup occurred, it was not in their lateral. So it seems like something should be able to be done. We spend a lot of money in a lot of other places.
Okay, well, I just take this to mean you think we should, it's a no-fault situation and we're self-insured.
It's a no-fault situation, but the town, I think it would be in the town's best interest, a little human relations, public relations, whatever you want to call it.
Chris, I might agree with you. I'm just trying to look at both sides. There's two sides to this. I think each side is reasonable.
Precedent, set it. But something should be done to help.
Okay, Gail.
I kind of agree with Chris that something should be done to help, and I want to respond to Josh's idea, or just the idea of finding a way to help. And one of the things that we might think about is we have our social services committee, and they make grants. If we were to look at a grant process for people who have sort of unmeasurable incidences, such as this, whether it's just something that we do with reflection on the sewer department, or if it's something that's broader than that in terms of acts of God, as they call it sometimes. Maybe it could become a part of something like the Social Services Committee, or it could be a program by itself. But I think as a community, we're all paying into this, and we all have sewers. And one day it could happen to any one of us. So it's just something to think about.
Thanks, Gail. Is there anyone else?
Just have
Oh,
another
go ahead,
quick
please.
question. Because we keep saying that it's no fault. Was that an insurance determination? And so if there was a problem with just the design that had nothing to do with anybody that's sitting here in this room or probably still even alive, the design of the sewer system in that area, if that was basically the initiative of the problem, would the insurance company still say it's no fault because the sewer was kind of actively working and has been working except for these intermittent problems? Is it because it wasn't designed to, I guess, or at least have like a fail-safe or second route to be able to handle these huge influxes of water?
I'm not an insurance specialist, so I really don't know how to answer that. But I have heard, either it was Gary who may have mentioned it at one of the select board meetings, that there's 3 components to fault, and one of them was the engineering, one was
Operation and
maintenance, and then just
maintenance,
something happening. So depending on what the engineers come back with, it's probably not so much an issue of whether it was designed correctly. It's a matter of whether or not we got residents that are tying stuff in that's against our ordinance. And for us to get out there and try to police that and go after it. So
I can help you on that. I think if there was a negligent design, then it would be fault, because it was negligent in the design. The key is whether it's negligent.
Right. I got it. See, if we had 10 people, and we were offering, instead of 4 times 35, we were offering a much smaller amount. No, I don't know that we'd call it self-insurance at that point. I think we'd be definitively grant or helping out, whatever. Oh, there's no question about the precedent. A police vehicle goes off the road, goes into somebody's kitchen. The homeowner's insurance doesn't cover all the costs. Our insurer doesn't cover the damages. Same situation. How many police cars, God forbid, should be off the road anyway, but how many are going to be in a year's time? That's a control of a kind. I'm suggesting controls of another kind that aren't just cosmetic. For instance, what if we phrase this as not to exceed a certain percentage of the insured, the insurance coverage, so that we, in the future, at least limited our precedent, to less than 50% of the insurance coverage.
Well, that's what I was wondering about.
Of the available no-fault layer at that point in time of the incident?
Well, and that raises issues. We're fortunate in this case. We have $30,000 for no fault, and none of it was used.
Yes, we're very fortunate.
What would have happened, and how would you suggest it be handled if, let's say, all of it had been used?
Well, that's my point.
Just like any other coverage, right? If you have an incident in January and it's exhausted, then that's how it goes. If you're a homeowner, right,
so
and you have a limit and you exhaust the limit.
If you kept in the context of insurance, you could control the precedent by making a percentage of available insurance monies. If you kept it in the context of community need, there'd be no requirement for such a control, and there probably wouldn't be any sense to have it. And you could phrase it as a grant.
Look,
I didn't even go that far. I tried to the numbers were modest. If there were another 0 on these, I would have had a different recommendation.
Sure. Yeah.
So the order of magnitude certainly played into this, in my opinion. There was a gap, and I thought it felt appropriate and equitable to try to bridge the gap based on everything I've talked about. It may not be the best rationale, so that's why we're having this conversation.
You know, one of the things I think is important for a board is when we ask one board member to spend extra time to go out, like you did with village safety, and now you, Jamie, coming in here, I want to pay special attention to your recommendation, because you put in a lot of time, and I think there are a couple of ways we could go here, and one of your way is, I think, a reasonable way. It might not be the way I would go to, but I'm willing to compromise. I'm willing to defer, and you know, frankly, if that's your recommendation, I'm ready to move on. You know, and so, Mr. Saar, would you like to say something?
Keep in mind, it's a recommendation that is put out to the residents. They don't need to accept that, right? They may not feel that this is an appropriate number, and that's fine. And then
I'll be very brief. Jamie, that was an excellent piece of work. Thank you for that. Thank you for the suggestion, which seems fair to me. Just on a basic question of equity, if I'm paying for a town septic system and the town septic system fails and floods my basement, I feel that the town owes me the repair costs. And if the town provides the septic system, they should be providing the insurance. Thank you.
That might be a very reasonable position, and I'm not arguing that. It's just a departure from where we're at. Please, and I'm sorry that you've had to go through this. Please take the microphone and identify yourself.
My neighbors who experienced this along with me were here, because they are better public speakers. And
If you could please identify yourself again.
I'm Jan Lawson. I live at 424 Hillside Terrace.
Thank you.
I feel this is an equitable recommendation for me. I can't speak for the others. I'm very glad that you are having someone come in to rate the flow and the capacity, etc. And I appreciate and want it to be a public report. A question that I have would regard any release that we would sign. How far into the future does that prevent me from making another claim if it should happen again?
I haven't thought about the release, to be honest with you, but in my mind it would sort of relate to that specific incident.
To this
right,
incident,
so you couldn't make a
right.
claim down the
Right.
road about this
Right.
incident on June 30th.
Usually releases are up until the date
Yeah.
of the signing of the release for all known or unknown causes of
Past,
actions
present,
relating
future
to.
claims with respect to that incident.
I appreciate the time and attitude of the staff and you all as you've dealt with this. And I hope you appreciate our attitude. We have had reporters and attorneys banging on our doors, and we've chosen to not go that route yet.
Yeah.
So I hope you do this.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.
Well,
You
look,
ready?
we've heard from, I think, everyone who wanted to speak, so would someone like to make a motion?
Yeah, I'd move approval of Jamie's recommendation.
Second.
Okay, I think Colleen seconded it before you, Josh, is that okay?
I don't care.
Okay, moved by Jerry, seconded by Colleen. Is there any further discussion?
I guess the only thing I'd like to suggest is that we do somewhere put it on the schedule to review the ordinance, possibly in time for when the sewer rate of discussion occurs, so we actually can look at this in a bigger picture as you suggest.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. The sewer ordinance it's older. I think we amended it about 7 or 8 years ago. I think, Peter, isn't that right? Didn't we do something? I think we did. But I think it's time for a real question is to address something like this for the future.
Right.
All right, so we have a motion. Any other further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, it passes.
What will the timeline be for receiving the reimbursement?
Well, we'll have to write up the, what do you call it?
You have to write up a release.
A release.
But the release should take
Try-
15
I
minutes.
mean,
10
we'll
minutes.
try to have it processed by Thursday, accounts payable, do our best.
Thank you. Look, this is sometimes issues aren't easy. There's a couple of sides to it. You know, we're trying. All right, next is item number 9. Consider approving a second-class liquor license for Associated Grocers of New York. This constitutes quasi-judicial matter. Does anyone have any disclosures they'd like to make in regard to this? And so people know, I think this is the Shelburne supermarket, right?
Shelburne, yep, these folks are purchasing 5 markets: Jericho Market, Johnson Market, Richmond Market, Shelburne Market, and Village Market in Waterbury.
So people know, they approached the town clerk a little late usually in the process for getting on the agenda, and Diana was very nice. She reached out to Joe and myself, and we decided to put it on immediately so we could hopefully help this business go forward without a break in being able to sell.
So you might know a New York Yankee fan would misread this as New York.
New England grocers.
Instead of a New England.
It's Giancarlo
Patriot
Stanton,
fan.
man. Giancarlo Stanton. All right, does anyone have any comments? Ken?
No comments, just a question.
Sure.
Who is the Associated Grocers? Is this like a super large chain? Is this a small chain? Or what are we headed for here?
I don't know. I don't know their size.
I thought
Are
this was a
It's a
Vermont-based
distributor
group.
co-op, I think.
You know, I can't tell you. I know they've been vetted, though. I mean,
I think
we asked Joe.
I think it's
Yeah.
A locally owned store.
Cooperative distributor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if
Jerry,
it's
it's a
based in Vermont.
There are others like it in New England. There's several in Maine, several large ones.
Associated Grocers.
So, I think at the back of their application lists all the stores that they own.
Yeah.
And it's
That
Few-
they
a
own
few
or they
pages-
distribute it to.
stockholders list.
Huh, okay.
It's a few pages worth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, either way, it's, I guess, probably wouldn't impact how we vote on it, but it's interesting to know. Anyone on the board have any comments on this? And Joe, you can confirm that this has been vetted?
Yeah, we do like we normally do. We ask the police department if they have any issues with it. They've said they don't. We have no reason as a staff not to recommend it. And just to be clear, a second-class license allows stores to sell beer and wine only for public consumption off-premise.
Right, okay. All right, someone like to make a motion approving this license for this entity?
So moved.
So moved.
Moved by Colleen, is that seconded by Jerry? Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, it's unanimous. Next is item number 10. Continued review of personnel, social media, and CMV alcohol and drug policies. I don't know if you guys saved your big packet from the week before. I see Jerry did. I got mine.
So
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't schedule a lot of time this evening for this, so I thought it might be more appropriate tonight, and I think you still owe me some questions to respond to, but maybe the most appropriate thing is to come up with a game plan of how we're going to tackle this moving forward. So I was thinking, Jerry contacted me also this week, that maybe at the next meeting, we could focus on the social media policy on the 19th and kind of delve into that, and then starting in the new year, we can take the personnel policy, maybe a quarter at a time. So I don't think that requires a formal motion, but for the next meeting, if people focus on the social media policy, and if between now and Friday, ideally, you could develop some questions to send me and Ann to give us a fighting chance to have them answered by next Tuesday, that would be helpful. So we'll plan on focusing on the social media policy on
So
Tuesday.
please,
next
everyone
Tuesday.
on the board, rather than surprising Joe on the 19th, shoot it to them ahead of time.
Not just the board, but the public too.
And the public,
It's-
anybody here have any comments about it, please shoot it to Joe.
I mean, if you can't get in by Friday, it's not the end of the world, but that just gives us the best chance as a staff to respond to them in a meaningful way.
All right, thanks,
You know,
so,
this really built on a notion that Jamie and then later on Josh expressed as well, that rather than ranging over the entirety, we would be better concentrating efforts on smaller pieces or chunks, as Jamie said, or batching. And I think that's really going to be efficient, and appreciate Joe's willingness to accommodate us.
Do we need to sort of divvy that up? And so I'm not quite sure, looking through it, I'm not really quite sure where the right
Do you want some
distinctions are.
suggestions from those of us that have the interest as to which groupings might make most sense per meeting?
In terms of the personnel policy part?
Yeah.
Well, why don't we make that determination next Tuesday? We know
Okay.
next Tuesday, we'll look at the social media policy, and
Okay.
maybe we can better define,
good.
starting in January, how we're gonna break up
Gotcha.
the
That sounds
policy.
Yep, good.
Okay?
great,
Yep, great.
thank you. All right, so let's move on to the next item, which is item 11. Consider a request to waive $267 in penalties for a late property tax payment for 263 Frogs End. All right, Joe, I think we have a one-page handwritten note on this, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me.
Just a disclosure on this, the resident, Tom Roots, and I were colleagues at Carrigree Mountain, so I have no
To be fair,
No
objective, act
conflict,
act in
I
the best
can-
interest of the town.
Yes, absolutely, but Tom and I were
I'm good with it. Everybody good with that?
co-workers.
Okay.
Yeah, and I had that here, and I don't know where it was.
All right, it's very short. Why don't I just read it so everybody knows what it says? It says, Dear
Joe.
Go.
Dear Joe, my name is Tom Roots. I have lived in Shelburne for almost 30 years, and at my current home for 22 plus years. My wife is going through some serious medical issues, and for the very first time I missed the town tax payment date. I am respectfully asking this town to waive one time my penalty of $267. Without going into details, we honestly got caught up in the issues in front of us and completely forgot the date. I appreciate your consideration. Name, address, phone number. That's the entire letter. It was handwritten, that's why I struggled a bit. All right, so Josh, I know you brought up maybe 2 months ago that you were interested in working on a policy for waiving penalties, and at the last meeting we asked if you had made any progress. I was wondering, have you made any progress on that?
No, but there's a reason for that. I mean, we all have the priorities, and
Okay, I'm just asking you because you were the one who brought it up.
No,
I'm
and
just
I
asking.
think it definitely needs to be done, because I think we every time we end up in this situation, there's this conflict between compassion and precedent and reality.
Yep, that's a fair comment.
And I'd really like to move forward. So when we have some time, and when I'd like to speak with Peter about his thoughts on this, I hope to be able to put something together.
In general, so people know what the town historically has done, in general, is we waive penalties in the case of death or military deployment or a sudden, unexpected, serious, very serious illness, like a heart attack or something, something like that. Is that fair, Peter? Summary of what we in the past we've done, or can you clarify it anymore?
Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. I think in some cases, if the property owner was in the hospital on the due date, we've waived the penalty in those situations if they physically weren't able to be here due to an emergency or something unexpected.
All right, so
Well,
anyone on the board have any?
Well, I know that what you're saying as far as precedent, but since I've been on the board, I've kind of disagreed with that precedent and felt that most of the cases that came before us, for the most part, not all of them, but most of them were extraneous circumstances. They all were able to provide proof of why they weren't able to pay the payment, and they all had a prior good history of paying their payments on time. And these aren't people that are asking to not pay their taxes. They're just asking for a one-time just waiving of a penalty. And while these seem common to us because we get them a lot, to these individual people, these are one-time occurrences. His wife is very, very ill. This is a one-time thing that's happening in their life. And while it seems like we're offering this fairly often, nobody's getting out of paying their taxes. We're just showing compassion to each individual situation. And I think that deserves a lot of consideration. So I move to waive the $267 in penalties for a late payment. Property tax payment for 263 Frogs End Road. And I know there will be further discussion, but the motion's there.
Moved by Colleen, is there a second?
I'll second it.
Second. I think, and Chris, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I think the last meeting we had, I think you spoke to this, and I think you said one of the things the board back, in 1840 when you were on the board,
Your hair's grayer than mine.
At least I still got somebody. I think one of the things you said was that you did look at the history of the taxpayer, and if they had a strong history, that was a factor you guys used to consider. I think that's what you said, right?
It was something we tried to do, not something we always managed to do, but for the most part, that was a consideration.
I'll tell you, for my first 7 years on this board, the people who I was serving with almost universally turned down every single one that came before us if it wasn't death or military deployment.
Well, and the other thing, maybe not a lot of people realize, is the only thing you're waiving is the penalty.
The penalty.
Not the interest.
Right. It's a very good point.
That was always brought out every time.
I
It's
think
just the penalty, not the interest.
So, maybe Joe, it's been a while since we talked about a policy. Do you think, I know you don't have much to do.
Well, I think it's actually, that's in the charter, the penalty part.
There is a penalty. We changed the penalty too. We changed, right? It used to be 8%, and we think we changed it to 5%. So we tried to be more reasonable in that regard. I'll get to you in a second. And, but maybe, Joe, do you think you could think about what you might recommend for a policy? Because I don't think this is going to be a big document. It's going to be like, consider waiving under these circumstances. Don't consider waiving under these circumstances.
A few bullet points.
It's a charter change. It's in the charter. 5% penalty.
Right, but that's the penalty. Now we're talking about a policy when to waive. So that's not in. That wouldn't be a charter issue.
Got it.
And as you said, you've been using military deployment, terminal illness, some benchmarks.
Yeah, you're right.
To waive it. But maybe you go one step further and say, for first-time offenders, it's a reduction.
Right.
You don't eliminate the whole thing.
Right.
You eliminate half of it.
Because this case would be a step further also because it's the spouse of the person.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think, sorry. Yes,
No.
Oh, no, I really agree with Colleen on this. My only concern is I think the request that we had on the last meeting almost was identical to this, and we didn't approve it. And so I think that using the slippery slope
I know we didn't approve it, but I thought there was a.
I wasn't here.
I
wasn't here then.
It was pretty similar. I don't have it.
It was
in front
similar.
Of me.
It wasn't as
and so
more
if,
compelling than this. Yeah.
And so I would think that this is the same problem that I've repeated over and over again. I feel really uncomfortable about the whole thing without having a policy. And so I think with the motion on the floor, we're in this situation that if we were to approve this, then we might retroactively need to approve the one we denied last time, just in the interest of fairness. So I'm pretty willing to consider both sides of this.
I think everybody on the board hates these. Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, I make several comments. First of all, I bear some responsibility for the fact that having made a point of offering my assistance to Josh in putting together the policy, and for probably some of the same reasons, there's been an awful lot of other stuff. It wasn't done, so I apologize. Secondly, my sense here is that we have loosened the okay here even further from the prior one, and I think until we develop a policy, it's better to strengthen rather than weaken, because the precedent just simply gets larger and longer. And in particular, at the last time we visited a situation like this, it was more compelling, and therefore I couldn't support this request.
Okay, does anyone else on the board have something to say? Anyone here have anything they'd like to add, Susan?
Oh, okay.
Susan McClellan, Falls Road. Personally, these kinds of requests really annoy me because Peter and the town go way far out trying to help us pay. You know, I had a problem one time. Now it's automatically taken out of an account. I don't even think about it. And, you know, maybe you could put that in the precedent. If someone misses, then suggest to them that they have it automatically.
It's a good idea.
You know, and to bring that a bit further, we own land in Isle of Mont, and I did miss my last payment, and I just sat down and wrote the check.
Thanks.
But and like where it was a member of your family deathly ill in the hospital. I mean, like these are like special circumstances. Like maybe one of the things that could be in that policy is if we waived this, would they agree to being on automatic withdrawal?
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting, that's
And then
a
it's
good
like a
idea to
compromise.
avoid the
Did have a
problem in the
you know.
future.
My mother was with me, and she was sick. She was living with me and dying of cancer. So
See, and I
yes.
would have waived your penalty. I absolutely would have.
Yeah.
I think
understand
that
both
these
positions.
considerations
Set
need to be
some kind
made.
of a precedent, and I think the town goes overboard to try to help people.
I will
pay
say,
their
I don't
taxes.
necessarily agree that we don't have a policy in place. It's just not a written policy, and so I do understand Josh's point that it would be helpful to have a written policy, but as Peter and I mentioned, we have had a policy in place for a long time. It's just when you get new board members and everybody has their own thoughts, it's hard to follow the same policy unless it's written down.
Right.
So we've had everything. Ms. Sage, or would you like to say something?
Yeah. Doris Sage, Marset Road. I think showing compassion to the residents, particularly if it's a one-time thing, is only right. I mean, all it is what you're still going to be charging them interest. They're still paying. It's just the penalty.
All right, I think everybody's had a chance to talk. We have a motion, we have a second. Is everybody good? Okay, all in favor of waiving the penalty?
Aye.
Against?
Nay.
Joshua, how did you come out?
Nay.
Nay? All right.
I mean, it was purely based on the consistency with last time. I mean, if we wanted to make another motion to include both of them together as a situation, I would potentially change my vote.
Okay. I move to waive the penalty from the one that I didn't hear about that was apparently more compelling than this one, and waive this $267 in penalties for this 263 Frogs End.
Second.
Moved by Colleen, seconded by Jamie. I'll tell you, I have, from a procedural standpoint, I have some questions about this simply because you weren't here and you don't know the facts of that matter.
I'm just taking it on the word of
And
Mr.
so
Story
I
that it was
have a
more
little
compelling.
I'm having a tough time understanding how you could vote on that.
Was it more compelling?
You know.
It was almost identical.
That's a judgment call. I think
Yeah.
that's a hard.
Okay,
that would
so
be
I
a hard
hear
read.
more
I think
compelling,
I mean,
identical.
can we just put this on hold and visit it all
Just
next
revisit
time
this,
and
yeah.
look at them both at the next meeting?
Well,
We already voted on it.
Oh,
yeah,
you're right.
we already,
right,
well,
right.
look, we have a motion. We have to address the motion. Somebody could move to then table that motion if you want
Okay,
to.
I'll move to table the motion until the next meeting. But I'd like to revisit this. I really honestly think that we're not getting rid of their tax obligation or the interest. The town isn't losing
I'm
a great
fine-
deal of money about
look,
it.
I'm
So that's
fine
my
with-
argument.
I'm fine with going almost any way you guys want to go on this. I just want to be consistent.
Okay,
That's
I agree.
All I want to be is
Right.
consistent.
I think
I
that's
agree.
reasonable.
You know, and
Okay.
so we have a motion to table the previous motion. Would someone like to second that?
Second.
Seconded by Josh. So first we vote on the second motion, the motion to table it, but we have discussion. Does anybody want to say anything on that?
So it's a motion to withdraw the second motion?
No, it's a motion to
No.
table the first motion, actually
Well, we're gonna
until.
talk about it next time.
I'm on top of this stuff. It's a motion to table the first motion until the next meeting. I would have
The one we voted on.
preferred to have tabled it until we had a written policy in place. But that's the motion that's before us. So we can always continue
Yeah, I'm
it.
not gonna wait that long.
To the next regular
Yeah.
meeting,
Yeah,
regular
wait that
meeting.
Regular meeting.
So,
Okay.
but that's go ahead, Joe.
The only point I was gonna make is it's probably, at least for the first one, it's not gonna be a waiver anymore, it's gonna be a reimbursement.
Right,
They paid.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm just guessing.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So we have the motion to table it. So any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, so that takes care of both those motions.
And what?
Oh,
All right,
next
next
meeting.
is item number 12. And by the way, just before we leave, if everyone and anyone here, if you have any thoughts on this policy, and I really think it could be a bullet point type policy, please send them to Joe before Friday. So you could just write it up, and really, it could be, penalties should be waived if owner dies. If owner's spouse dies, or someone in the immediate family. So whatever you want to say, military deployment. If there's a history of 5 years or more of paying on time.
And
Plus, there is a commitment to enter into the automatic payment program if the penalty is waived. Whatever you think is appropriate. I don't care what you think is appropriate, but just please send it to Joe so he can compile it, and we don't have to spend a crazy amount of time on it. All right? Mr. Sarr.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to say, I think that that's an impossible task, to try to detail every conceivable human tragedy and discomfort that might arise and prevent a taxpayer. So, you've got to leave it open-ended, but be generous.
Well, I think that could be part of what is proposed, Mr. Sarr. Next item is an item that Jerry had suggested. Consider resolution proposed by Jerry Story to recognize contributions by Pat Scheidel. I'll just turn it over to Jerry.
I'll be very brief because between Joe and I, we'll write up this, if everybody's okay, for signature tomorrow. The timing is what it is because Friday there is a board meeting which will be Pat Scheidel's last official meeting, and this resolution is aimed at recognizing his considerable service over a period of 24 years, 20 of which he has chaired the Property and Casualty Intermunicipal Fund, which you've heard referred to earlier tonight, the passive fund, which is a Vermont League of Cities and Towns insurance organization. And Pat, who's retiring as the town manager of Essex City and Town, has again chaired that board for 20 years. He's served on the board for 24, and this resolution recognizes that extraordinary service, which every community in Maine, it's late. No, it's not late. It's unforgivable. But every community in Vermont by which we've all benefited, because in that period of time, the insurer has expanded programs, has created efficiencies in cost, which has reduced premium costs ultimately to the local level, so he can be held responsible and thanked for activities that in the end benefited us, and that's what this is about.
So I would entertain a motion to continue this matter until tomorrow's agenda.
Can I just
Yeah, you can add something, but let's.
So
Okay,
moved.
Moved by
That's fine.
Jamie,
Second.
seconded by Colleen. Go ahead.
No, I can either put it off until tomorrow or speak now. I don't really care. I mean, all I think it's just temporarily, since we keep talking about precedents and slippery slopes, I don't have any problem with it, but I just want to point out that we could spend a lot of time making resolutions in support of people who do things in the state, in New England, in the country. And so I just want to be realistic about, okay.
I think that's a good point, and quite frankly, I think it'd be a good precedent to set. And a lot of times boards can do that through like a consent agenda. And that's
A
something
what?
that, a consent agenda, so it might not always take up X amount of time, whether it's for Paul Goodrich's, 50 years or someone like Pat. I could talk a lot about what Pat has meant to Vermont in a lot of different areas, but I think it is something maybe that the board should do more of, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well, actually, I do think there's a way to wed all these ideas together. I think Josh is correct. Making resolutions to recognize people from other communities is a slippery slope. However, in this case, this is someone who worked on a board that serviced Shelburne in addition to other communities. So I think there is a distinction here. Also, I think it's important for us to compromise. If we have a board member who really wants something, it's part of compromising. So anyway, we have a motion to continue in a second till tomorrow. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
All right. Next, public comments. Anyone else have additional public comments? Not on tonight's agenda. Dr. Metz.
I've been asked to read the following statement by Mr. Davies Allen. Today, I estimate that over 50 tons of salt were placed on town roads today, all of which will end up in the groundwater and streams. Number two, be prepared for me possibly to file a temporary injunction against the town should the board elect to file an appeal on the railroad issue. Thank you, Davies Allen.
Thank you, Dr. Metz. And Mr. Boyd, you had something? I mean, Dr. Metz, I'm sorry.
Been called a lot of things. So, first of all, a heads up. So Front Porch Forum has lit up tonight, your favorite little topic. And it's lit up from both sides on the very topic of Vermont Railway. So I can honestly tell you by what's going out over Front Porch, your inboxes are going to fill. You're going to hear both sides. And on Front Porch, there's also 2 different posts that indicate there's an anonymous donor that wants to cover all the expenses for taking this fight to New York City. Now, to me, that's hearsay. And this board had been presented with a $2,500 check to cover legal expenses for the ethics committee, and that was flatly turned down because it was regarding a budgetary item, and that wasn't going to be taken. So that money ended up going to the library because that was a building function. So in the same light, no matter how generous, and again, there's no name to it, it's anonymous, so it's hard to say it's valid. But if it were, it's regarding budgetary items. And taking money like that for budgetary items, I think the precedent's already been set, can't be done. So I would fall back to, again, one thing that's always been said by many boards, not just, I think I've heard it some from you folks, but from a lot of different boards, I believe Ken has said it before. This town has always looked to try and make housing in this town as affordable as it can, so everyone can appreciate this town. And this will run the risk of running the expenses up to a point to where that might be a difficult task to undertake. Also keep in mind, there may be the potential for some new board members. So I don't know who's running again, who's not running again, who stays, who goes, whatever. What dynamic does that throw into it with new board members? So just another thing to contemplate when having your discussions.
Okay, is there anyone else? Okay, hearing nothing, it's time for select board comments. Jamie, why don't we start with you tonight?
No comments, Mr. Chair.
Colleen.
Driving here, the police were already hard at work. There was a car off the road and an officer stopped just to help while a tow truck helped the person out. Nobody was injured. And it was just, the roads were bad, and it was important for me to see that the people who keep us safe are out there.
Thank you. I'll just jump in. I usually go last. There's two things I want to bring up that I don't want this board to miss out on. And that is, Joe read a letter from an attorney he employed. I think it's incumbent upon this board to respond. Part of that letter requested a correction of the record from what was said by a board member previously. So I'm going to ask everyone to please review the letter and to please, if you think it appropriate, to review the tape of the date that's in the letter from Joe to see if it's accurate or if it's inaccurate or it could be characterized in a different way, so this board can determine what, if any, response would be appropriate. And that's an employment issue, so that's something I'm hoping we can also discuss on the 19th. So I'm giving everybody a heads up to please take the time to review the tape so everybody can speak from knowledge. The other thing I'd like to talk about is, and I've spoken with several people on this board about this, and that is our ethics ordinance, the rules of procedure for the ethics committee, and the application of the ethics ordinance by the ethics committee, and how it apparently differed from the application of the ordinance by the ethics committee pro tem. And I think this is an area that is of concern to many people in town. And I think it's a fair item for us to put on an agenda. It has been an item that has resulted in many complaints after many years of no complaints for whatever reasons. I think people have different thoughts on that. But I would like to do our best to address it in a reasonable manner. So I'm going to suggest that we put it for a discussion. I've heard many people say, or several people say, they would like to see changes on the ethics committee, on the ordinance itself, and on the rules of procedure that the ethics committee adopted. I think it should be a discussion. What do you guys think?
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I would hope we could invite the chair and the entire committee to that conversation. I think it's an important one. There's some work to do on that ordinance, in my opinion.
And I know that the ethics committee, I think at their next regular meeting, is going to be discussing changes to the ordinance. So I'm not sure that we should step in and necessarily have a select board discussion if we know that the ethics committee is actually working on dealing with the issues and the things that have because I think as the committee, they deserve first crack at making any modifications that they think needs to be done. And then certainly, as you say, it would be a valuable thing to have a discussion with the committee. But I think they have, since they've already initiated the process to discuss changes, I think that would be a good thing to let them do.
Well, I think it's important for us to try to work cooperatively, not only with the Ethics Committee, but with anyone else who might be interested in participating, have public comments on it, invite the Pro Tem Committee, and statutorily, it is not the Ethics Committee who passes ordinances.
Right.
It is the Select Board.
Right.
In addition, I'll give everybody a chance to talk. In addition, the ordinance itself provides that it is the Select Board who makes amendments to the ordinance. And in this case, this ordinance was not only passed by the then Select Board a few years ago, it was passed and subject to a town-wide vote, which the town passed. So we have an entirely new situation here, which I am unaware that we've had ever before in town, where we have an ordinance that was not only passed by the Select Board, but it was passed by the entire town. Now, that ordinance does contemplate amendments by the Select Board, but I would suggest that it bears discussion. If there were going to be wholesale changes to the ordinance, maybe it needs to go back to the entire town for vote again. I think this is a new arena. I doubt there's much history in other communities on this, but I would rather do it in a cooperative manner with as many people participating as possible. We need to address it. We've had some major issues over the last couple of months, and frankly, this has been a major concern to many people who have been involved in town government, not just the people who've been coming for the last 3 or 4 months, but people involved have been aware of this issue for 8 or 10 months. It's been a real issue. So I think we should do something about it.
I think Josh raises a fair point. There can be some benefit to giving a committee a head start, but this is one where I think a dual track approach might actually have benefits. It'll give us a chance to look at it with a fresh, clean set of eyes, independent, not colored by what that committee's changes might be. And then we have an opportunity to reconcile it, right? We can sort of look at their edits, we can look at our collective edits and figure out if
and then we have
if there's an approach that's amenable to both groups.
Joe?
Yeah, I just want to make 2 points. So if the Select Board worked on it kind of with the Ethics Committee, that's really in line. For example, a while back, we invited the Planning Commission in to talk about comprehensive plan updates because the Select Board didn't want the Planning Commission to start going off in a direction that the Select Board wasn't going to support, and the Planning Commission did not want to go off in some direction that the Select Board was not going to support. So I think there's kind of an analogy there. Second of all, there's some important information that people need to understand, and I will have an opinion by the next Select Board meeting. I believe the document that I'm going to allude to now from an attorney from our insurance carrier is going to be a public document, but I think it's a very important piece of information that the board needs to be aware of as amendments to the ethics ordinance and the future of the ethics ordinance is considered, and it would be I don't know what the right word is, but it needs to be understood, and I hope by the next meeting I will have clarification, which I assume I will, from VLCT Passive, that the correspondence is a public record and that will be provided. Because it's fundamental to the future of
I understand it's fundamental to the future of all volunteers on every board in Shelburne. And it's something that might impact where we want to go with a revised, amended ordinance, because our volunteers are so very important, and we have to make sure in my view anyway, that our volunteers are protected and not subject to,
Well, they need to know what
they need to know what
protections are.
what their protections are. And if the select board has to do something, we have to do something. I know the state, I see Jessica's hand up, the state is still interested in getting involved in passing legislation for ethics reform for municipalities. And I know Vermont League of Cities and Towns have weighed in on this also. But Jessica, would you like to say something on this?
I was just going to quickly say that the ethics, we did pass legislation that requested or required towns
Towns to have
throughout
their own.
Vermont to pass their own, to work on their own conflict of interest policy, not really an ethics policy.
That's not ordinance.
Right,
It's
an
policy,
ordinance, a
different.
policy,
Yeah.
ordinance. Everybody does it a little different. But interesting, I think that the Vermont League of Cities and Towns could be helpful to you all. They're there as a resource, and they know they've collected the data on what all other towns are doing. Some are doing things that are more complicated than what you all are doing, and some are doing much less. And there's specific reasons for a lot of those towns to do what they're doing. So it might be helpful to have someone come from Vermont League of Cities and Towns.
Yeah, we've had conversations with them. All right,
So,
thank you. That's it.
well, no, I mean, I like to sort of circle around and just sort of try to figure out where we are in some of this, because I think Jamie has some good points. So, but with all of those other comments, I'm really worried about might become a jumble, because if the ethics committee is going to proceed one way, Joe has another information that maybe we need to have some communication with the ethics committee, find out what their ideas are. And I think I can't remember who said the collaborative approach is probably a good one to take here. If everybody has concerns, I know the ethics committee has called for a public participation in their next meeting and for people to send in ideas, which is in a whole lot different from what has been suggested here. And I think there is probably merit to looking at this in a pretty comprehensive manner. And I think Jamie's point that, we know that the ethics committee was the one who drafted this initially, which led to the vote. So, again, there are lots of different processes.
Just, you weren't on the board yet.
Yes, I know.
That's not the way it worked, though. But go ahead. I mean, it started back when Jane McKnight was on the board. She was the one who passed the ordinance. We had an ordinance passed, I think it was in 2009. And then certain members on the select board worked with certain members on the ethics committee. And frankly, it was Tom Little, Lee Suskin, and myself worked together on the amended ethics ordinance. So it wasn't just the ethics committee who worked on that. And that was all taken from Jane McKnight's original work, which came in great part from the Vermont League of Cities and Towns.
So I think we're all really talking about pretty similar things. All I'm suggesting is that before we go off in all the different groups go off in different directions, we really set a logical process of A, B, C, D, and where are we going to end up. That's all I'm suggesting, is that rather than people going in lots of different ways, we stop and sort of.
You're going to see the ethics committee tomorrow at 2:30. So
let's do
that's
that.
a good idea.
Let's
you might be
address
able to
it
talk
then.
to them a little bit.
That's a great idea, Joe.
All right, so we can
Good.
talk about it then, and hopefully, I think we're all in agreement. We want to do this in a collaborative manner. We want to make the ethics ordinance, the ethics rules of procedure, and the application of the ethics ordinance to be clarified, uniform, and appropriate. That's what we're trying to do, right? All right, so let's bring it up tomorrow when they come in.
Great.
Jerry?
I have two comments and then a third inspired by Chris. First, I'd like to thank you again, Tom, for your effort last Saturday recording the meeting. Someone happened to mention to me today that they had listened to the tape. I was sort of not aware, but gee, that was a tremendous thing for you to do. on your own. I really thank you. Secondly, I recommend to everybody the annual report that Tom Zanatti, who unfortunately has now left, did on the Shelburne food shelf. For its comprehensiveness, for its economy of language, for the kind of data that's in there about our community, the degree of need in our own community, among our own residents. It's specific to Shelburne. And it's a very convincing case for whatever any of us can afford to contribute to them, that we should. It's really an outstanding piece of work. And thirdly, to respond to your comment about what at the moment I'm going to take as just an idea floating around, an abstract, this figure of 20,000. And I know no more about it other than having seen it. But I did speak forcefully, you may remember, on a prior occasion, about what I thought was the catastrophic effect of a town accepting private monies, therefore establishing a special interest for activities that the town itself should in its conduct finance or fund. It's not quite the distinction of budget, whether they've been budgeted. It's because towns get gifts of many kinds, but ordinarily those are gifts of things that the town either can't afford on its own, have been unable to fund, or are extraordinary in the sense of a property that the town could not just literally find enough monies to pay for. To me, there's a great distinction between that and funding an activity that the town routinely, regularly carries out, but in a case chooses not to, and therefore relies on substitute monies coming from a private party, which to me establishes a special interest of a kind, no matter how noble the purpose, is simply totally unacceptable for a municipality. And I'm not shy about speaking forcefully to that point again.
That's three things. So Josh, do you have anything?
Yeah, well, following up on Jerry's time. Tom, could you please tell people where they can access these recordings that you've made? I think that would be helpful.
It's Tom Tompkins, everybody.
Well, the one that Jerry spoke of, I did because VCAM did not do a video. And so that one is available through the town's website. It's listed as an audio file rather than the usual VCAM. Generally, I don't put things up there that VCAM has recorded on my website, that is, simply because it's kind of duplication.
Okay, thank you. I think that's just right. And secondly, given the weather out here, I've said it before, I'm just really impressed with the number of people who have come out to participate. And so it says a lot about interest in town government.
Okay, Joe, number 15, town manager's report.
I really don't have anything except I want to echo what Jerry said and thank Tom. Not only did he come through for us last week, but he's going to come through for us again tomorrow all day, and it works out really well.
Come early for bagels.
Do you get lunch?
and it works out really well. Tom runs his own community radio station, which I think is really cool, and he's been good enough to allow us to link directly from our website to his station to pick up the recordings that he makes of some of these meetings that it wouldn't be expected for VCAM to make. So he's been outstanding, and thank you, Tom.
All right, we have number...
Thanks, Tom. Hold out for a free lunch.
Number 16 is consider entering executive session for 1 VSA section 313A1 to First, review a potential settlement agreement in the matter of SAR v. Town of Shelburne, and second, to discuss the town's litigation strategy in response to the Conservation Law Foundation's appeal of wastewater treatment plant permits issued by the state of Vermont, which includes the permit for WWTP number 1. The first is to consider a motion that premature general knowledge of the proposed settlement agreement in the matter of SAR versus the town of Shelburne and the town's potential litigation strategy in response to the Conservation Laws Foundation appeal of the wastewater treatment permit would put the select board at a substantial disadvantage.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Jamie and seconded by Jerry. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Someone like to make the next motion, or do you want me to do it and just so move? I'd entertain a motion to enter executive session to discuss first the proposed settlement agreement in the matter of town of SAR versus the town of Shelburne, and second, the town's potential litigation strategy in response to the Conservation Laws Foundation of the wastewater treatment plant permits issued by the state of Vermont, including the permit issued for WWTP number 1, and invite the town manager.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Colleen with a yawn and seconded by Jamie.
I just want to say something.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wouldn't expect this to take long. If people are interested, I think that there'll be at least one, if not two motions after executive session. I can't promise that, obviously. It's what the board does. And then the other thing I would say to the board is if you want to, you could leave your budget binders right here, because this is where we'll be tomorrow at 8. So if you want to just leave them on the table, that's fine. We're going to be right here.
Oh,
Okay. So, are you going to stay on? Because I have a feeling we're going to be back in in 5 minutes, I was just told. I was going to say 12. Okay, I'd like to reconvene the December 12th, 2017 Select Board meeting and invite Jerry to make a motion.
I move that that we conclude the executive session and re-enter open session.
Okay, moved by Jerry. Is there a second? Second. For discussion, I'll just be very brief. Jerry and I had a discussion about this. This is a departure from past practice that we've done in town. I don't think there's anything wrong for making this motion. However, in all the statutes, there is no requirement to make this motion. In all the articles I've read on this topic, not one article speaks to this. But in an effort to compromise and respect my fellow select board members, I'm going to vote in favor of it, even though I think it's an unnecessary motion. Okay, anybody else have anything?
Nope.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right. Next, we have 2 items. The first I'm going to turn over to Jerry because it was mediation and it involves a settlement agreement in the matter of SAR versus the town of Shelburne, and Jerry was the select board member who represented the select board at the mediation. So Jerry.
And Mr. Sarr is present. This is a settlement agreement between John and Amy Sarr and the town, which provides for a payment of an amount of $17,500 to fully settle all monetary claims, including claims for fines and attorney's fees in the lawsuit, which regards a notice of violation that the town issued to the SARs and which they appealed. Provides as well for planting of a certain number of trees and as well for efforts at erosion, reseeding, and log removal. And will be available as a public document for anyone who wishes to consider it in more detail. It's always a pleasure on the part of all parties to reach agreement, and that's what this is, and this is proposed for board approval at this time.
So is there a motion to approve the settlement agreement as summarized by Jerry?
So moved.
Moved by Colleen. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Mr. Sarr, you're welcome to say anything if you'd like to. By no means do you have to.
After I don't.
Okay. Anyone else have anything they'd like to add? Hearing nothing, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Next, I'd entertain a motion to authorize the town attorney to respond as he sees or she sees appropriate in an amount not to exceed $5,000 in legal costs in regard to the Conservation Law Foundation's appeal of wastewater treatment plant permits issued by the state of Vermont, which includes the permit for WWTP number 1.
So moved.
Moved by Colleen, is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Jamie, I think beat you by second. Any discussion on this? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Someone like to
Move to
make
dismiss.
a move to adjourn by
So
Colleen?
moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Jerry. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Done. Thank you very much for waiting.